Allora, buongiorno a tutti. Come preside di questa facoltà vi do il benvenuto. Benvenuto innanzitutto ai nostri ospiti molto qualificati e importanti che ci onorano della loro presenza. E devo subito, prima di tutto, ringraziare Roberto Caso, Paolo Guardia e Giulia Dore per aver organizzato questo importante incontro, perché il tema della Open Science è un tema al quale la comunità di ricerca, animata da Roberto, da Paolo, da Giulia, ma anche da altri nostri colleghi, da tempo lavora. È un tema che riguarda molto da vicino i metodi della ricerca, la comunicazione della ricerca, ma è un tema che riguarda tantissimo il nostro essere cittadini, perché il ruolo della comunicazione scientifica all'interno del contesto sociale, culturale ed economico globale di oggi è fondamentale. C'è una responsabilità diffusa degli studiosi, dei ricercatori, e quindi discutere su quale può essere il modo con cui condividere i risultati della ricerca, i metodi della ricerca, i progetti e i processi di ricerca assume una valenza davvero determinante. Quindi è un tema che interessa tutti, non interessa soltanto gli studiosi che si occupano specificamente di questo. Vorrei dire che c'è un altro aspetto molto significativo, non solo in termini di cittadinanza, come vi dicevo, ma anche in termini di governo in senso lato di alcuni processi di appropriazione di dati e di informazioni su scala globale. L'accesso libero alla ricerca, la open science, la condivisione di dati è un modo per contrastare processi di aggregazione di dati, informazioni e di risultati della ricerca che possono essere particolarmente delicati e complessi, particolarmente pericolosi anche, se vogliamo. Quindi non stiamo parlando di qualche cosa che riguarda, come vi dicevo, i soli addetti ai lavori, stiamo parlando di qualche cosa che può precostituire un presidio, per così dire, per essenziali libertà, che non sono solo le libertà della scienza o della ricerca o, come dire, dell'esplorazione scientifica, sono anche altre libertà. Quindi non posso che ringraziare nuovamente i colleghi che si sono occupati di organizzare questa bella giornata di incontro e di discussione, che in larga parte tra l'altro valorizza anche delle ottime buone pratiche presenti in Ateneo. Infatti ci sono qui presenti anche colleghi di altri dipartimenti e centri. Li devo invitare a continuare questo dialogo, a stringere ancora di più questo tema, perché è qualcosa al quale questa facoltà tiene davvero molto. Quindi grazie ancora Roberto, grazie Paolo, grazie Giulia, e spero che l'incontro di oggi possa essere fruttuoso, proficuo per tutti. Grazie ancora.
Grazie al preside, professor Fulvio Cortese, perché il suo saluto istituzionale è stato assolutamente non banale e invece denso di riferimenti importanti, quali il fatto che l'open science è qualcosa che ha a che fare con la democrazia, anche se non ha pronunciato questo termine, il suo implicito riferimento era appunto a questo. Quindi lo ringrazio, perché noi ci sforzeremo di portare avanti questa ricerca e questa attività, perché non è solo ricerca ma è anche il tentativo di mettere in pratica dei principi, e quindi diciamo lo ringrazio doppiamente anche per l'auspicio. Allora mi tocca ringraziare, oltre al preside, una serie di istituzioni e persone, innanzitutto la Facoltà di Giurisprudenza, che in questo momento è incarnata dal preside Fulvio Cortese, per aver supportato e ospitato l'iniziativa, ma anche l'Università di Trento, perché questo è un progetto di è una conferenza che fa parte di un'azione del piano strategico di Ateneo e quindi siamo finanziati come convegno grazie a questo progetto specifico nell'ambito del progetto strategico. Non è un caso che la conferenza si svolga nella Facoltà di Giurisprudenza, che investe da anni, come ha ricordato il preside poc'anzi, nell'open access, nell'accesso aperto alla conoscenza scientifica. Cerchiamo di applicare i principi anche nella nostra facoltà, tant'è che abbiamo le nostre collane di libri, siamo stati credo una delle prime facoltà in Italia a pubblicare in open access le proprie collane di libri monografiche e riguardanti la miscellanea. Abbiamo 2 riviste in open access, il Biolaw Journal e il Trento Student Law Review, che saranno presentati nel pomeriggio. Abbiamo anche dei working papers del gruppo Low-Tech, il research paper e gli student paper, che 2 serie che portiamo avanti da un po' di tempo. E dunque quindi diciamo la Facoltà di Giurisprudenza mi sembra una sede ideale per parlare di open access. Dirò alcune cose ancora in italiano e poi passeremo all'inglese, perché le 2 lingue di lavoro sono l'italiano e l'inglese, e la prima sessione sarà in inglese. Do il benvenuto quindi a tutti a questa iniziativa, perché si iscrive poi in un più ampio panorama, che è quello dell'Open Access Week. Da diversi anni in giro per il mondo si festeggia e si promuove l'Open Access con una serie di iniziative. Quindi immaginate che in questo momento da tante parti del mondo ci sono eventi simili che provano a spingere in avanti l'Open Access. E il tema evocato dal preside poc'anzi, cioè il nesso fra la scienza aperta e la democrazia, è anche un tema che occupa l'Associazione Italiana per la Promozione della Scienza Aperta, che è una delle istituzioni coinvolte nella organizzazione di questo evento, e quindi c'è un lancio ideale del 4º convegno annuale che si svolgerà a Cagliari l'8 e 9 novembre. Chi volesse partecipare all'iniziativa, anche se non è proprio vicina, sappia che è il benvenuto. Consentitemi anche di ringraziare il rettore, il professor Paolo Collini, il Senato accademico e l'Ateneo, che appunto ha supportato finanziariamente la conferenza nell'ambito del progetto strategico, e l'Associazione Italiana della Promozione della Scienza Aperta, che partecipa qui con una serie di suoi membri autorevoli: Maria Chiara Pievatolo, Paola Galimberti, Elena Giglia, Paola Gargiulo. Vorrei ringraziare poi anche gli ospiti, in particolare quelli stranieri che hanno fatto una lunga strada per arrivare fino a Trento, e anche io voglio ringraziare Paolo Guarda e Giulia Dora, che hanno organizzato assieme a me e si spendono anche come relatori nel pomeriggio. Un ringraziamento poi va alla segreteria organizzativa, in particolare alla dottoressa Giorgia Sartori del nostro staff. Che cosa cerco di dirvi in 2 parole in questa brevissima presentazione? Qual è l'innesco del nostro ragionamento? Abbiamo provato, quando abbiamo concepito la locandina del convegno e la brochure pubblicitaria, che abbiamo provato a porre delle domande molto semplici. Non entrerò nella teoria dell'open science, perché questa sarà meglio illustrata dai relatori che seguiranno. Però la domanda iniziale, appunto l'innesco del nostro ragionamento, è: qual è il ruolo dell'università, cioè di un'istituzione che dovrebbe essere no profit nella scienza aperta? Se avessimo voluto rispondere qualche anno fa a questa domanda, forse il primo riferimento sarebbe stato quella della dichiarazione di Berlino. La Berlin Declaration del 2003 enfatizzava il fatto che le istituzioni accademiche, scientifiche e pubbliche, finanziate con fondi pubblici, dovrebbero svolgere un ruolo centrale, si dovrebbero riappropriare di una scienza che è sempre più nelle mani invece di soggetti commerciali. E quindi questa dichiarazione auspicava il fatto che almeno una copia della pubblicazione scientifica fosse depositata in un archivio istituzionale di un'istituzione appunto no profit. Questo sia allo scopo di garantire una conservazione nel tempo, ma soprattutto allo scopo di innescare il dialogo pubblico della ragione, cioè far sì che la pubblicazione sia sottoposta al giudizio critico attraverso la rete internet. E qual è il bilancio che noi possiamo trarre a 15 anni da quella dichiarazione? Purtroppo, diciamo, la parte no profit della scienza, della quale l'università dovrebbe essere un attore di fondamentale importanza, non si è riappropriata della scienza e non ha il totale controllo della scienza aperta, tant'è che il più grande editore commerciale al mondo si fregia di essere uno dei principali attori dell'open science, anzi diciamo pubblicizza anche nella sua home page il fatto di essere un player dell'open science. Elsevier diciamo, organizza corsi, partecipa alle conferenze, presentandosi come uno dei protagonisti e fa una serie di altre attività che hanno a che fare con l'open science. Ovviamente lo fa dalla prospettiva di un attore commerciale che detiene peraltro una posizione di grande forza, e questo per profili che attengono al modo con cui si valuta la scienza. Quindi Elsevier è un oligopolista, tende ad essere quasi un monopolista perché ha un pezzo importante del mercato e si comporta come si comporterebbe un attore forte del mercato, cioè chiede per praticare l'open access somme anche molto molto ingenti. Quindi il commercio sull'open access. Ma diciamo non è solo il fatto che vende l'open access direttamente, è che Elsevier, come altri editori, grandi editori commerciali, sta cercando di colonizzare le infrastrutture della open science. Quindi quell'auspicio del 2003 era quello per cui le istituzioni non profit dovevano innanzitutto riappropriarsi delle infrastrutture, è messo a rischio dalla costante strategia commerciale di questi grandi editori che prendono via via pezzi delle infrastrutture dell'open science. Mi riferisco, qui abbiamo un professore autorevole degli Stati Uniti, che è il professor Reichman. Buona parte dell'infrastruttura dell'open access statunitense è ora nelle mani di Elsevier. Social Science Research Network e Bpress sono state recentemente acquistate. Erano due repository che erano nati con scopi no profit che sono stati cannibalizzati da Elsevier. E poi c'è tutta la storia dei social network scientifici, come Academia.edu, che è uno dei repository più frequentati dai ricercatori scientifici, e i quali spesso preferiscono utilizzare una infrastruttura di questo genere invece che utilizzare infrastrutture pubbliche che sono nelle mani di soggetti non commerciali, per esempio Zenodo dell'Unione Europea e del CERN di Ginevra. Quindi perché i ricercatori scelgono di pubblicare sui social network scientifici e invece sono così resistenti ad utilizzare le infrastrutture pubbliche? Partiamo dalla nostra anagrafe della ricerca. Qui noi abbiamo un'anagrafe della ricerca, IRIS, che anche integra, come in tante università italiane, l'open access. Quindi oltre a certificare con i metadati la pubblicazione su una rivista scientifica o di un libro, noi avremmo la possibilità, se abbiamo ben gestito i diritti d'autore, di ripubblicare almeno una versione nel nostro repository istituzionale. Perché questo non accade così di frequente? Ci stiamo interrogando su questo e stiamo cercando di andare avanti con le nostre policy per incentivare la ripubblicazione in open access sul nostro repository istituzionale. Ma ovviamente facendo questo brevissimo excursus di quella che è l'evoluzione delle infrastrutture e dei modelli di business che si muovono intorno alla scienza aperta, non posso non fare riferimento a quanto era evocato poc'anzi dal preside, cioè che uno dei rischi maggiori è proprio quello dell'aggregazione del potere di controllo dell'informazione più in generale su internet. Come si accede adesso alla scienza? Si va sempre sulla rivista di riferimento o sulla serie di riferimento? Molto spesso accediamo da motori di ricerca generalista. Ora, io so che tutti quanti voi usate DuckDuckGo e che quindi non avete mai sentito parlare di Google, soprattutto di Google Research. Però diciamo, io purtroppo ne sono in qualche modo preda, cioè ne faccio uso, perché so che Google ha una potenza che magari altri motori di ricerca non hanno. Quindi chiunque si confronta con Google, e Google, come vedete, utilizza una strategia di colonizzazione della conoscenza. Passa da Google generalista a Google Scholar, che è il motore diciamo specializzato nella scienza, fino ad arrivare a Google Books, la cui vicenda innesca interessanti problemi riguardanti la proprietà intellettuale. Allora, se l'open science corre il rischio di essere colonizzata dal mercato, è una responsabilità dei soggetti commerciali o delle istituzioni no profit come l'università? Perdonatemi questa semplificazione, ma questo è, secondo me, il punto da cui noi dobbiamo partire e diciamo, cerco di lasciare un indizio su quello che è il mio modo di vedere le cose, che poi ho avuto modo di scrivere in maniera più ordinata in altre occasioni. Cioè, io credo che ci sia un vero problema a livello di valutazione della ricerca, il solo fatto che noi abbiamo mutato il nostro modo di definirci, non siamo più professori, siamo addetti alla ricerca, non siamo più ricercatori, siamo addetti alla ricerca, o non facciamo più delle pubblicazioni ma produciamo dei prodotti della ricerca, significa che ci stanno levando addirittura il linguaggio, cioè ci tolgono il modo di pensare, quindi distruggono la nostra identità di liberi pensatori, e questo è, secondo me, il vero problema per cui noi dovremmo riflettere sulla definizione di open science. Open science, dal mio punto di vista, non significa solo dare la possibilità di accedere al materiale scientifico con diritti di riuso e quindi dando la possibilità di innescare scienza sulla scienza, ma significa anche occuparsi del potere e quindi dell'accentramento del potere, della democrazia, del pluralismo e di quello che la scienza sta diventando nel tempo. Okay, I think we can switch to English, and I have to start the first session of the conference. The first session of the conference will address the interplay between open science and intellectual property. We have two very prominent IP scholars as speakers. The first speaker is Jerry Reichman. Jerry Reichman is Bunyan Womble Professor of Law at Duke Law School. He's written and lectured widely on diverse aspects of intellectual property law, including comparative and intellectual property law and connection between intellectual property and international trade law. Today, Professor Reichman will present a very relevant essay on the topic, written with Professor Ruto Gdigi, now Professor of Law at Harvard University, entitled When Copyright and Science Collide. Sorry. If you want, you have the floor, Jerry. Okay.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
Is this, can you hear me? Is this, okay. Well, buongiorno, è un gran piacere essere qui, Trento è più splendido di quanto immaginavo mai, che è veramente bello qui. Purtroppo devo parlarvi in inglese perché non riesco a presentare questo paper un po' astratto diversamente, così I will now switch to English. Well, as you heard, information technology is transforming all the fields of science, especially in molecular biology, but including genomics, proteomics, and it's spawning whole new fields of metagenomics and metabolomics. The combination of massive storage capacity, powerful data manipulation techniques, and graphical capabilities has revolutionized how basic research is conducted and how the resulting knowledge is preserved and disseminated in all fields of science. These methodologies have also helped to generate networked communities of users and collaborators, often working in dynamic knowledge hubs, whose interactive collaborations steer computational science in potentially more fruitful directions and fill virtual repositories with new data and information. Well, this is a very promising research environment, and in it, scientists increasingly rely on automated knowledge discovery tools to mine and recombine vast amounts of data and literature that are flowing at rates that exceed the capacity of any single investigator to comprehend or to manage. Exploitation of these new opportunities, in turn, requires integration of information and data scattered over a broad range of articles and databases that may or may not be available online for extensive computational research. For example, the use of computational methodologies such as bioinformatics in linking global collections of articles and data to create relevant research results makes it possible to build cumulative field-specific knowledge repositories that capture reams of relevant scientific data and technical information, and to develop general data mining tools for applications in the chosen environment. Lots more value is created in this than we ever had before. The digitization of scientific information and has thus engendered opportunities for the enhanced speed of dissemination of publicly funded research results, for the development of high-performing research engines that diminish the search time for publications, and for automated cross-linking and text mining based on standardized metadata. The goal of this digital infrastructure should be to maximize these opportunities for public research institutions and universities in both developed and developing countries, while maintaining the classical functions of certification and diffusion of research results from the pre-digital paradigm. In reality, intellectual property laws as currently configured stand in the way of obtaining these goals. Since the 1990s in particular, there has been an unprecedented extension of copyright law and related rights protecting both literature and collections of data into the realm of basic science, with no adequate exceptions for research as such. In my view, copyright and database protection laws impede access to data and literature pose a greater and more immediate obstacle to upstream scientific research and open scientific research than gene patents and related issues that have attracted much more attention in the literature. Let me see if I can make a little bit clear why this tension exists. In the European Union, for example, the Information Society Directive of 2001, I think we have it up there, but I can't see they're numbered, but no, it's not moving. Okay, it's if you want, you can move it. Yeah. Okay, maybe this clicker is not moving anything. It might be just that you have to aim it. Okay, well, it doesn't matter. It was just off. Working out? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah, okay. So in the European Union, we have the Information Society Directive 2001, which provides this narrow and ambiguous and non-mandatory exception for non-commercial scientific research, whatever that is. And it also, the directive also has a new provision on private use. This is what scientists used to use before this narrow research exemption was the private use exemption. And now they have put a fair compensation clause onto this very provision. Have I got it up there? It also subjected both scientific research and private use to an outer, narrow, and rigorous application of the notorious three-step test ostensibly derived from Article 9 of the Berne Convention in 1967, and then embedded in the TRIPS agreement, in Article 13 of the TRIPS agreement of in 1994. Notice something about this three-step test. According to the way that it's interpreted by court so far, all three steps have to have an affirmative answer. And that was also the position of the WTO panel that has done one copyright case involving the three-step test. The directive then allows scientific publishers to surround literature and data transmitted online with electronic fences and digital locks. What's the consequence of that? Well, any user rights, first of all, any user rights that survive can be overridden by contract. You can't go through the fence, you have to go through an entryway into the electronic gateway. When you go through the gateway, you have to sign an electronic contract which says, I waive all my rights, any rights that I may have to use this, etc., etc. And the only rights I have are the ones you give me under the contract, in which I can't do anything without your permission. Okay. So, and then the coup de grace is that in 1996, we got the EU directive on the legal protection of databases, which gives potentially longer and stronger protection to non-copyrightable compilations of data than to copyrightable scientific literature. Fortunately, I was represented the national academies in the United States, and we were able to defeat that proposed enactment into United States law. So this legal framework embodies a set of rules and policies that are diametrically opposed to the needs of scientific research in a universe of discourse where automated knowledge discovery tools must freely explore the entire range of thematically relevant, digitally distributed literature and data. Consider, for example, that the Wellcome Trust found that 87% of the material housed in the United Kingdom's main medical research database, UK PubMed Central, was unavailable for illegal text mining and data mining. By the same token, a major independent study also by the British government reported that copyright laws made it virtually impossible to text mine about 1,000 journal articles from the first half of the 20th century that described malaria in indigenous populations and soldiers, and as well as details of the therapeutic measures available in that early period. Because of rights clearing requirements that are out of all proportion to any benefits the right holders could want, even if they could be found, researchers may not be able to digitally index or text mine sources that offer potentially significant insight for the development of methods for preventing and treating malaria today. You will notice that there is no fair use provision in European Union law, only this hard-nosed version of the three-step test. Now, in the United States, we are fortunate to have, if I got 107 up here? Yeah, okay. In the United States, we are fortunate to have a fair use provision in our copyright law. And fair use does a much better job on a case-by-case basis. But fair use cannot handle computational methods, text mining, the use of automated discovery tools much better than the EU's rigid designated exception approach. On the contrary, the systematic need that researchers as users of automated knowledge discovery tools have to survey vast or indeed unlimited amounts of literature and data in virtually every contemporary large-scale scientific investigation, especially in the life science, it just overwhelms the boundaries set by the four-step test of Section 107, and it increasingly makes a mockery of the very concept of fair use. Consider, for example, that the implicit purpose, we have a substantiality test in 107.3 there. It says there should be a reasonable use of the text. The implicit purpose of this substantiality test in the step 3 is, let me just point out, one good thing about fair use is that the court does not have to give a yes answer to each of these criteria. It has to weigh each criteria and then give an overall weight evaluation. So it's much more flexible than the three-step test. But if you look at step 3, the fair use reproductions of a protected test must be quantitatively and qualitatively reasonable in relation to the work as a whole. Well, in no area, not even in parody, which is a sacred cow of American fair use, nowhere can this provision be interpreted to permit wholesale reproduction of every relevant text in every relevant case, which routinely occurs in computational science or in any scientific research project where automated knowledge discovery tools are employed. By the same token, the market harm test of 107.4, the last one, it becomes drained of all precedential meaning if the scientific texts that we're scrutinizing are published to serve two purposes, both the research needs of scientific community and the commercial interests of publishers. So that imposes very serious limits on fair use. For example, one must immediately confront the possibility that from a rights holder's perspective, publisher's perspective, massive copying of published research articles to generate further research by means of automated knowledge discovery tools arguably represents both a substitutional and an expressive use of these same articles, which is prohibited by copyright law. Even if that were precisely what scientists and authors most clearly desire in their relentless pursuit of reputational benefits, that's what scientists want, a reputational benefit, fair use on this scale is hardly consistent with the aims of commercial science publishers. If only scientific researchers were involved as both creators and users of their own published works, then we could come up with some formulas for fair use that would work. I won't go into them here. And then you would have the question of whether scientists opted in or opted out to these exclusions. But any scientist who didn't opt in would be severely penalized by his fellow and criticized by his fellow scientists. So if scientists were handling it, we could handle fair use. Notice more, but we don't. It's the publishers that are handling it. Notice, moreover, that any fair uses that survived this analysis could be wiped out by the online service providers. The Digital Millennium Copyright Act allows U.S. publishers, like their European counterparts, to surround the transmissions with these electronic fences and to, by contract, override all of these rights. Now, if we take a step back, what we see is that wittingly or unwittingly, these laws force scientific researchers to choose between two outcomes that are equally distasteful. They have to choose between ignoring all these unreasonable intellectual property laws and becoming, in fact, infringers because they don't want to bother with it, or they have to try to conform to these rigid laws, and it just doesn't work. The end result guts both science and the larger public interest in the end result puts both science and the larger public interest in a no-win situation at a time when the resources available for funding scientific research are shrinking. If the relevant intellectual property laws were strictly enforced, and if the scientific community respected them seriously, then scarce public resources earmarked for basic research would be siphoned off by commercial publishers. In that event, the public pays twice for the same outputs. Notice, the public pays twice. Why? Plus a surcharge for mushrooming transaction costs. Now, why does they pay twice? Because the government is funding the science in the first place through the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health, and then you want the public to pay for having to access it from commercial publishers. This makes no sense at all. Conversely, if intellectual property laws are routinely ignored by researchers determined to carry on with their work despite these unreasonable legal constraints, then automated knowledge discovery tools will have become transformed into engines of massive infringement. It is hard to see how systematic disregard of intellectual property laws, coupled with growing contempt for the legislative process that fosters them, will benefit authors, artists, and other creators in the long run, especially when those condemned to outlaw status are not free riders on costly musical and cinematic productions, but publicly funded scientific researchers in pursuit of greater knowledge and applications that benefit humanity as a whole. Now, if you try to imagine a legislative fix to this science hostile regime, it would have to be a much more radical set of provisions and exemptions than anything we have ever seen. In that regard, there is a new proposed research treaty coming out of the Washington University American College of Law that really a lot of thought has gone into. It's a beautiful proposed treaty for education and scientific research. But the question on the table remains, who in the present world would come near to having it enacted? There is absolutely no possibility of having it enacted at all. And that also includes the Max Planck Declaration of 2008, which is very important, which courts could follow if they wanted to, but they have not followed it at all. While endorsing all of these proposals, we think more may be needed. In particular, scientists must be free to subject any published article and any article made public available online to data mining procedures and data manipulation by automated knowledge discovery tools, including virtual scientific experimentation, without any constraint other than attribution under the norms of science. The same exceptions must apply to all public release of selectively chosen materials in any scientific paper or report. Such a regime should be applied directly and in harmonized express terms in the copyright laws of every European Union member state, without any alliance for the sort of self-seeking, for the sort of detailed provisions that are currently thought necessary for a workable system of users' rights. When you hear that workable system of users' rights, it usually means in practice an unreasonable system of publishers' constraints on science. Complementary legislation would then have to forbid publishers from using technical protection measures and digital rights management procedures, and these are electronic fences, to negate the use for scientific research by non-negotiable contracts. This can be done directly, or a state could adopt another type of regime. Pam Samuelson and I proposed a reverse notice and takedown possibility, because you can't go into the database or you lose your rights. So our proposal was to throw a flaming arrow over the electronic fence, requiring the owners of the online delivery system to, I'm sorry, I didn't see that. 10 minutes. Okay. To provide what is really available under fair use. But that is going nowhere either. And then, of course, database protection laws, where applicable, would have to be aligned with any set of pro-research exceptions in copyright law. And then, of course, you need a more flexible approach to the three-step test, which the Max Planck has forcefully, beautifully elaborated, but it stands no chance of being operated either. So there is no way that such a massive legislative overhaul could ever be enacted in the current political situation. And what is likely to get instead is ever more restrictive laws. because the publishers' lobby is so powerful. And so that poses the question I really want to raise here. Should scientific publishers' customary interests be preserved at the expense of scientists' needs for wholesale access to and reuse of the exploding universe of published scientific literature and data? And that question, in turn, raises ancillary questions about what added value the scientific community obtains from its traditional reliance on external, for-profit publishers. And what would be the opportunity costs if the scientific communities were to break their ties to the publishing industry? And I have discussed these also at greater length in my book, Governing Digitally Integrated Genetic Resources, Data, and Literature, that was published last year. The basic premise is that the scientific community has to contractually create its own research commons for data and literature with its own set of rules. In this context, we think publishers no longer add enough value to justify the existing scheme, especially when most scientific research is funded by governments or foundations to begin with. The point is that desktop publishing techniques and online digital transmissions have made it technically feasible to redefine the role of existing intermediaries who benefit from research-hostile intellectual property laws and practices. By the same token, these publicly funded research results are made available to the scientific community. Once they are made available to the scientific community with due respect for attribution, it becomes logical to ask why any scientist qua users should ever pay other scientists for publishers for a right to use their work. As I say, we end up with a system in which we're all paying twice, and the publishers are making are the obstacle. So why do we need them? In the law school community in the United States, we threw them out. We don't have any intermediary publishers. 300 law journals are published every month in the United States. We have student editors. All the articles are peer-reviewed. We don't dispense with peer review. All the articles are peer-reviewed. And we don't pay a dime to publishers. What do we pay? We pay printers to print the works. And they get we get good value for the money. And somehow the law schools have managed to survive without paying the publishers. So it is not some abstract idea that we're talking about. It is a proven concept that works. And I don't know why we can't persuade universities to do it. I have more, but that is the gist of what I would propose. And since we have time, I'll stop there and take questions.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Professor Reichman, for this presentation. I think we can open the discussion after the second presentations of the second speaker. The second speaker is Richard Gold. Richard Gold is James McGill Professor at McGill University, Montreal in Quebec. Professor Gold was the founding director of the Center for Intellectual Property Policy at McGill. He teaches in the area of intellectual property, international intellectual property, comparative intellectual property, innovation policy, and intellectual property management. Today, Professor Gold will talk about open science in neurodegenerative disease research and innovation, the case of Montreal Neurological Institute. He wrote an article on this topic published on PLOS Biology, a very famous journal in open access. So, you have the floor. If you prefer this one.
Sure. I also need my slides.
Yeah.
Okay, or a new? This one? Yes, perfect. Thank you. Hello. I'm going to try coming up here. We'll see if this works. Sorry. So I'm going to speak to you about a particular project happening in Montreal, at the Montreal Neurological Institute. I'll touch on some of the other work we're doing in terms of the theory and the data gathering. So there are several aspects to this project, but I'm just going to focus today on describing the project and why the MNI, as I will call it, Montreal Neurological Institute and Hospital, takes a long time, is experimenting with this. Of course, I'm standing in front of my own slides. And if I speak too quickly, because I speak too quickly even for an English audience, let me know. So the the MNI, is an institution in Montreal that dates back not quite 100 years, into 1934, and has been implicated with some very good research, some very bad research around LSD and the CIA. But it was founded by Walter Penfield, who was trying to map out the human brain and where the different sites. So he's the one who put little pins in the brain as he was stimulating different parts of the body. It is unique in the sense that it runs from pure research in the laboratory to clinical research to delivery of healthcare. So they have patients with relationships with the doctors, but they also do research. It's affiliated with McGill University, so most of the people there are both a member of the hospital and of McGill University, which makes administration very difficult, but I won't go there. As you can see, it's got about half and half clinical staff and research staff at the hospital, and it sits on, if you've been to Montreal, at the top of the mountain. Okay, so why did the MNI, out of all the institutions in the world, decide to experiment with open science? And I'll come to the definition of what open science is a bit later. Mostly it comes from the fact that it's their community that they're serving that is unsatisfied with what's going on. We know neurological diseases are a tremendous burden to society, costing, at least in Canada, a lot of money. And by 2040, we actually think there'll be more cases of neurological diseases as the population ages than cancer. The central problem is we haven't advanced the science. This is one area where we have no real new treatments for diseases such as Parkinson's disease, ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, for 30 years. Yes, we have a few new drugs, but they're all of the same type. We have no breakthroughs. And all the researchers who have been involved with this are frustrated. They've been devoting their lives to trying to find something and haven't been able to. The patients are frustrated because we haven't been able to solve some of these important diseases. And so because of that, more than anything else, this level of frustration, they just said the system is not working. Whatever we're doing today is not generating the results that we want, and so we need to try something different. And the tool that they decided to use was open science, based on a model that came out of the Structural Genomics Consortium, which is based in Toronto, Oxford, and at the Karolinska Institute and a few other places. A little bit. There's one in Frankfurt as well. But what's different between what the MNI is doing and everybody else is that this is across the entire platform of research done there. Everything from pure research to clinical research. There's approximately 60 laboratories, each of which is part of this, whereas previous to this, open science has been limited to a particular project. So instead of being all over the place, as is the MNI, they've been restricted to members who come together for a very narrow purpose, as opposed to here, which is for all purposes. Their goal is to accelerate science and eventually accelerate the delivery of services to patients. So they believe that open science will increase their ability to impact the environment. They're also hopeful it will increase the quality of the data coming out. We don't know that yet. And reduce duplication. That is, we won't have multiple centers doing the exact same experiment. Again, we don't know that yet, but that's the hope. Okay, so that is why the MNI is doing this. And I'll come back to how they're implementing it. But let me just step back and talk about definitions. One of the problems in the area of open science is nobody agrees on what it means. So far today, we've been talking about open science in terms of open publication. But in fact, it goes beyond that. You put 10 open scientists together in a room and you have 10 different definitions of open science. So at a higher level, there are two separate kinds of meanings. One is it's a way of doing science. That is, it goes back to Mertonian principles of openness and sharing, and so it includes tools such as e-notebooks, where researchers, as they're doing their experiments, electronically record what they're doing and make it available to the world. It includes data sharing. We talked a little bit about that, or Jerry talked a little bit about that. It also includes some notions of citizen science, getting the general public involved with doing science in one way or another and having access to science. So it's a ideological, philosophical approach to what science ought to be and the tools that make that available. The other way, and this is more novel, and this is where the MNI comes in, is to look at open science as a way of structuring relationships among partners trying to solve a set of problems. So it's not science open for openness sake. It's because of a belief that going open will actually accelerate research and innovation in a given context. And that's why it sounds right to the researchers at the Montreal Neurological Institute, because their concern is about accelerating science. So the way that we are looking at it at the MNI and my group, which is studying the MNI, is that open science is a tool or a model of organization. We use intellectual property, but we're not, and for many of the reasons that Jerry was talking about, aren't trying to change it. We're trying to take it into account and then impose a model of cooperation around it. So this is our definition. I can tell you how we derived it if you really want to know, but this is it, and has a few set of, it's a fairly long definition, unfortunately, a few components to it. First, it's a set of institutional policies. That's not institution in the sense of an organization, but of norms that surround a community. It includes infrastructure. Infrastructure is incredibly important to open science. It is the most costly element to it. So you have the European Open Science Cloud. It takes years to develop. And you need people to actually use it, and you have to build that infrastructure and relationships. And it relates to three things in our view at a minimum. You can go beyond this. Open access publication, that means anybody could read it. Open data, that means your data is made available to anyone and anybody can use it. So it's not enough that you just make it available if no one's allowed to download it. That includes scientific resources. So that would include assays or materials and so on. It also includes in the open data metadata, that is data about the data, how it was collected, what its limitations are. Because if you're going to do any analysis of large data sets and you don't know how the data was collected, it's useless. Right, so if we're going to use artificial intelligence, etc., they need to know what biases went into the creation of that data, or else it will result in just a biased result. And the lack, and this is the additional component, the lack of restrictive intellectual property rights. Because making knowledge available but not allowing anybody to use it is not particularly useful. And this is the point where we diverge from the traditional definitions of open science. Because unless you take care of intellectual property, in my view, and for many of the reasons that Jerry talked about, it is not going to be effective in actually accelerating research. And the goal has to be the acceleration of research. So that's our definition. So why again? So I mentioned the frustration of the researchers at the M&I. So they were doing this from a gut level experience of being frustrated, but we can actually look at the literature, look at the data, and come up with a little bit more formalized reasons why we need open science. And I'll show you a couple of graphs to support it. I've got a whole slideshow if you want, just on this point. But there are two things that are surprising to us, because we live in an age where we have constant technology coming at us. We feel that we're overwhelmed. But the funny thing is that we're suffering from two problems. One is the cost of research is not only increasing, but increasing exponentially. And I'll show you a line that shows that in a minute. The second is that we're producing less per person. That is, for every researcher we fund, we are getting less out of that person. Now, that would seem to lead you to the conclusion that we should be seeing less and less innovation, less and less research productivity overall, but it's not, because we keep spending our way out of it. So the reason that we have to spend more and more money on research is because each researcher is producing less. And as long as you keep spending more and more, you maintain a level of innovation. But there's a problem. There's only so much we can spend. And when we hit that limit, we start to see decreases. And there's some evidence that we have reached that point. We also know, and again, this is surprising, that the economic contribution of innovation has been going down. It reached a peak in about 1950, decreased until 1970. There was a little blip between 1994 and 2004, and then we're back down again. That is, the contribution to the real economy is decreasing. Again, counterintuitive when you see iPhones and so on, but we're not seeing it in the economic numbers. What we hope is that open science reduces costs and increases productivity. That's its goal, and therefore helps address this problem. So let me just show you the graphs. This is US expenditures from 1920 to 1965, and it continues, that red line just continues to go up post then. I just didn't have enough time to show you all my graphs. Right, so this has actually been, it started in about 1930, 40. It's been just growing massively. At the time when government started to spend directly on R&D, we saw massive increases. This is a recent paper, came out about a year ago, and was revised in the fall. And you can see two important lines. You have this. So this is the research productivity measured. There are a bunch of different ways to measure this. One is just scientific outcomes. One is patents. One is crop yields. Another way is life expectancy increases. No matter which scale you use, you get that line. That is, we're getting less and less per person. And at the same time, we have the green line, which is not in terms of dollars here, but it could be, but it also could, here it's just the number of researchers, which is the major component of research costs. And I have about 10 other graphs I can show you, but I have to finish in about 13 minutes. Okay, so we need to contrast the idea of open science from some other ideas. We've already mentioned a couple of these, but the first one, the biggest confusion is between open science and open innovation. Open innovation is not open science. Open innovation is closed science. It is a term that was developed in the management literature to deal with firms that have intellectual property but are not attaining the full value of that intellectual property. To attain the full value of the intellectual property, they need to find customers or people who are willing to license it and pay them for it. So the idea here is I'm only using 20% of the value of my intellectual property. Someone else could make another use of it. I will license them to make use of that, and they will return to me some fee. This is not wide open use. This is used to 1 or 2 or 3 other partners. It is closed science because it's not available to the public. There's no attempt to share data, no attempt to share knowledge. This is really inter-firm maximizing the value of the intellectual property. It's a very good thing because it does create more value, but it's not open science. Open access, we've talked about making things available, and there are a whole bunch of platforms, so the PLOS journals, there's eLife, and then the F1000, which is another platform that's actually even faster. You put your article up there, that's what I currently use through the MNI. You put your article out there, the peer review is done online. The disadvantage is there's no editor. So you don't have editing of the work, but you have online review and revisions. And then open data, which is making both the data and the metadata open. And then also making materials available, although that sometimes has to be restricted because you have limited supplies. So open science is a combination of the open access and open data, as I said, and the avoidance of restrictive IP. Now, we can't change the law, so the law does allow for intellectual property. So the way you avoid it is by developing both institutional policies, educating people, and building something that's more attractive to researchers than the alternative of obtaining a patent and using a restrictive platform. Okay, again, the goals I've kind of gone over, the quality and credibility of outputs, efficiency of the system, broadening sources of funding to include more philanthropy, and hopefully generating more knowledge. So I'm going to return to the Montreal Neurological Institute, and how it went about it. So it made its decision based on this frustration. The MNI has a benign dictatorship. There is someone at the top. It is an institution that's apart from McGill. And so the leadership was able to come up with the idea of open science, but they realized they could not implement it unless they had acceptance by the entire community. So you need leadership often to get it started. It would not work unless the senior management decided this was the way to go and was willing to spend their time convincing people of this. But it would not work in fact unless all the laboratories, researchers, postdoctoral fellows, students, and staff also believed in it. And as I said, so they acknowledged this, and they spent about 18 months just talking about it. They didn't actually know what open science was. They hadn't thought it through in terms of these are the mechanics. They just believed in it as a principle to accelerate research, and they discussed it a lot internally. They hired us, we're not really hired, but they engaged us as another unit at the university to talk to them. We did some qualitative studies to try and figure out what the concerns were, and we helped them develop policies and principles that they were, after this 18-month period, able to adopt. And there are 5 of them. I'm not going to go through them in great depth, but they're in the slides. So the idea here is, first, dissemination of the data and resources as quickly as possible, and certainly no later than the data publication. But many units made the data available immediately upon development of it. And it will depend on where you are in the spectrum from pure research to later on, how much double checking you need to do, and so on. So there are a whole bunch of factors that determine when is the right time to publish, but certainly the data has to be fully available, and the materials as of the date of publication. So they had to figure out, how do we make this possible for our researchers, because this is not costless. We need to build an infrastructure to make this happen. And so they've developed this F1000 platform. Yes, I have 10 minutes left. Is that right? Less? 5? Let's see where I'm going. Okay, 7. Okay, principle 2. The same principle applies, let me go back. There's also no intellectual property on anything they develop. I'll come to that. The same principles apply to their partners. So that means every time the M&I engages with an external partner, whether it be a pharmaceutical company, a biotech company, an artificial intelligence company, they must accept that in terms of that engagement, whatever they do together, all the data will be put out and there'll be no restrictive intellectual property on it. There were some worries from the clinical community within the M&I about this, that firms wouldn't engage with them. Firms are very enthusiastic about this, and there's one central reason. The universities are terrible managers of intellectual property. One of the main reasons firms do not work with universities is because they don't want to spend 6, 9, 12, or 18 months negotiating about intellectual property with the university. We patent the wrong things in the wrong way at the wrong time. It is a barrier to cooperation. But that wasn't the impression that many of the clinicians had. The firms all said, oh, this is great, but the community wasn't convinced at the beginning. Also, we have to make all the biobanks and other repositories. So the M&I has a bunch of IPS cells. What are IPS cells? Stem cells. I can never remember the, anyway, I don't, my memory for acronyms this is about 3 o'clock in the morning for me, so, you know. So stem cells, they have, because they have a relationship with patients, they can actually collect blood samples and other samples from the patients. They have genetic databases and so on. All of that is made available. They also have a drug platform, so assays and drug targets and so on. They are not allowed to patent. Nothing the M&I does, they will patent. This goes contrary to the direction that most universities have been moving in since about 1980, where they patented everything and so on. They said, we are not going to pay for any patents. We will not ourselves acquire patents. We will not support the patenting of anything. But, and this is an important caveat because we are talking about a public institution, we will not force anyone. Nobody in our community will be forced. No patient who doesn't want to donate their data or their samples will be hurt. They will get the same quality of care whether or not they agree. No researcher will be prohibited or thrown out of the university if they decide to spend their own money to acquire a patent. We will just not do it. Now, the reality is a US patent costs about $10,000. If you want to get international patents, it's more. No researcher wants to pay for this because they're smart enough to know they're not going to make any money off of it. But in theory, they are allowed. We just don't expect anybody to do it. There was also a focus on trainees, so postdocs, early stage researchers, and their ability to build up their portfolio so that they can attain a job, and to make sure that this openness doesn't actually differentially harm junior researchers. Now, so far, in fact, this has been a great advantage to junior researchers because those who have been putting out their data in electronic laboratory books have made all kinds of international connections they otherwise never would. They are getting fellowships and other opportunities by giving away their data because they're recognized for the quality of the work they're doing and people are interested and bring them on board. What we don't know is whether that will last, whether that's a first mover advantage because these are the first people in the world doing it and so they're attracting the attention. We don't know if it's sustainable in the long term. Some questions that are still open. So the implementation is, it's easy, well, relatively easy to come up with principles. The implementation is difficult. It depends on the laboratory, the type of research, the type of data. There are several concerns around consent from the patients because you're asking a patient to consent to any conceivable experiment using their data. At the same time, we have an obligation to protect the privacy of the patient. How do we achieve that? Most institutions that have done this so far require, like the University of Aarhus has adopted these type of principles. There's some other centers. You have to go to the central university and have a notarized agreement that you will comply with confidentiality obligations. You impose that on a researcher, you're basically telling them, forget about it, don't use this database. No one will ever do that. So we need to find tools to deliver the data in a way that's respectful of privacy. So we're working on that. They're also, how do you translate what we come up with into innovation, right? It's great to do research. How do we get products out there? So they're actually building an open science business unit. The Structural Genomics Consortium just did one last year called M4K, Medicines for Kids. That's looking at a brain cancer, fairly rare brain cancer in children. Everything is in the open, no patents. They're going to be using data protection if they ever develop anything. But all their data is out there. All their strategic meetings are available online. This is radical openness. And yet, how do we find the business case to allow firms to participate and hopefully come out of the environment and provide opportunities for postdocs and graduate students? The other thing that the M&I has to look at is how do we promote professors? We have to make sure that we take into account their openness. Impact factor can no longer be that important in the scientific community because most of these open platforms don't use it. We also have to convince governments that when they set up their review committees and allocate funding, that they do the same things. So in fact, our first target is not the university. So M&I will do this internally. It's actually the funders. We are working with our federal governments. We are working with philanthropy to get them to experiment with open science calls. That is, they say, we'll give you this amount of money if you comply with open science principles. The Wellcome Trust did so this summer. It's a relatively small amount of money. For scientific purposes, it's 50,000 pounds. But we're hoping for more and more experimentation so that the peer review does not become a problem. Okay, so open science, from our perspective, is a process, a relationship between individuals. It is not just a state your principles and go away. It is a lot of work, both in terms of building infrastructure, getting buy-in, getting normative principles adopted and accepted. It needs both top-level leadership for even the conversation to start, but it cannot work without, as I said, the bottom-up participation. Everybody has to feel that they have a stake in it and have a voice in it. It also is critical to its long-term success. That's not just the internal research community at the Montreal Neurological Institute, but the patients they serve. They must feel that they have a greater voice, that they can use the data coming out. It's presented to them in a way they can use and communicate with their own communities, and then have a say in what research is done. That will require a change in research culture. You also have to train a lot of librarians. This is, job promotion for librarians. They're the people who actually know how to handle data. We need a bunch of experts in making sure that we find the right data set for what we're doing. We understand the limitations of it, and we construct the data in a way that is transparent and includes the metadata. And it's a continual process of change. So on top of what the M&I is doing, which is actually experimenting with open science, we have another experiment, which is looking at what they're doing. We are trying to learn what they're doing and what the outputs are. And so we're collecting data not only from the M&I and the SGC, but we're hoping from a bunch of other partners around the world, in the UK, in different places, to actually assess the level of openness and some concrete outcomes from publication to delivery of services to training, etc. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard, for this presentation. You offered a very complex picture of open science, and I found many suggestions in your presentation, but I prefer to open the discussion to the public, and because we have 30 minutes to discuss, and then we have a break at 11 before the second session. So we can open the discussion. Yeah. Professor Carlo Minussi of the University of Trento.
Thank you for both presentations. I got a very general question for both of you. Publication, open publication. We should sponsor open publication, but that is costly. In an area like neuroscience, as you probably know, it's almost impossible to publish your own journal or to publish your papers in some repository. In terms of value, you have to publish on journals that cost quite a lot, like from $3,000 to $5,000 or euro. So how do you solve that problem? How can you invest that much money in sponsor researcher to pay those publications to be open?
Well, it was a part of my paper that I didn't have time to get into. The publishers have to be paid for the services they actually provide. We don't have to turn them into big profit-making enterprises. Okay, where did the costs come from? Well, they're going to have to come from universities. We fund our law schools as part of our basic operation. We fund our law journals, but the law journals become huge training machines out there in the universe of lawyers who are hiring young lawyers. They will always try to find people who have had law journal experience and pay more for them. They're the most sought after graduates that we have. So if the universities would incorporate with the libraries, because it is very important to incorporate with the libraries, the publishing mechanism, they would find that it would have all kinds of payoffs that they don't expect coming later, okay? And it would all, one of the things that I was particularly struck by in your wonderful lecture was, well, okay, but how do we then sell these open science students to industry? Well, if they come through a system in which they're actually contributing to the publishing output, they're very valuable. As I say, you cannot imagine the first thing that the big firms are looking for in law schools are people who are on the law journal. Then they're looking for the editors of the law journal. Okay, so this is something we should a proof of concept that other departments need to share, in my view.
So I put up here just the MNI platform based on F1000. The Wellcome Trust has a similar platform. The Gates Foundation has a similar platform. So the F1000 does cost money. All of this costs money. The infrastructure is the most important. And so when the MNI adopted this, they knew they would have to invest in making open access available. So there are two components to it. One is just the sheer cost. So the creation of a platform is less expensive than paying the 3,000 to 5,000 euros for open access. But the second is these don't have high impact factors. So if you're worried about impact factor and that's the way you assess people, then that won't work. So you have to change it. And there's the alt metrics. There are a whole bunch of new metrics being used and developed that have to be incorporated by the university. So the university has to make two decisions. One is they will create their own open platforms and make it quickly available. For a senior researcher, this is incredibly attractive because as a senior researcher, we frankly don't care about the impact factor, we care about speed. I put up an article, I didn't do it, last week. It will probably be peer reviewed in 2 to 3 weeks openly, and that's great for me and any of the junior researchers on it. The junior researcher, so we're moving away from science and so on because we can afford to. The junior researcher is where it comes down, and so you have to change your criteria for how you evaluate people, both on grant reviews, and so you have to work with governments and with the institutions, and we're making progress. But the last bit is you have to do what the Gates Foundation does, which is it puts aside money for open publication. So they've created a portal that you put your article on, it will get placed wherever you want it, and they will automatically pay the open access fee. So all this costs money. Someone has to pay, either the end user or up front. So we're encouraging grantors to include payment of fees, and then the creation of these platforms that make it more accessible. But in the long term, it's really changing reliance on impact factors. One of the interesting things is there's a study on impact factors. The higher the impact factor, the less original the paper. There's an inverse proportion. And the number of citations is actually higher outside of the mainstream, but it takes about 8 or 9 years. So the problem is we're focused on short-term impact, which is actually a very poor measurement of contribution, and we need to change that.
Let me just add that there's a very important open science project underway in the European Union in medicine. It's the COMPARE project, COMPARE, and it's trying to, all caps, and it's trying to improve the ability of scientists to track the outbreaks of pandemic diseases and track them faster, predict where they're going to go, and come up with resources. And they are spending a fortune with 60 researchers. Everything is pooled, and now they have found that they have such valuable research outputs that they're going to have to fund a biorepository in which all of these ongoing results will be deposited and made available for everybody else. But this is happening. It isn't just proposals, it's happening on the ground.
Other questions?
Thank you. This is for Professor Gold. So you mentioned the motivation of MNI to accelerate research in order to move to open science, but because of frustration, no breakthroughs. But one thing that maybe it's inside this, but maybe you could stress more, is the reproducibility issue of science. So from the point of view of, let's say, a clinical institute, I understand this tension to accelerate research and have new tools. But from, let's say, research side, I see very little reproducibility in many studies, and let's say open science is going towards that. So can you maybe spend more time on that?
Indeed. So the Structural Genomics Consortium is a consortium of very large pharmaceutical firms, some biotech firms, a bunch of universities, funded principally by philanthropy, well, about a quarter from industry, the rest is from philanthropy and from governments. And their goal is to come up with the three-dimensional structure of proteins. They're responsible for about 25% of all structures done in the world so far. They're the only ones that pharma relies upon because they know they have exceedingly high reproducibility. Because they're not in the game of other things that scientists have to get into. They have very strict rules about when something gets published. That's why I said you don't necessarily want to put your data out immediately all the time. There might be a quality control period that you need, so that's why it has to be individualized. But part of this is to overcome the reproducibility problem because there's a huge incentive on us to publish whether or not the result is reproducible. One of the hopes, but we don't know yet, is that knowing that your data and your papers are open to everyone, that the data underlying your paper is going to be analyzed very easily. Some people think, we don't know yet for sure, that will increase quality because people aren't going to want to be embarrassed. That is, people won't get away with, because you can't hide your data and you're going to be publicly exposed if you come up with bad data, that will increase it. So there's some hope for that. The other group of people say, well, you can make everything public and therefore there's no quality control and so we're going to decrease it. It's a problem, so we don't know yet. And one of the things we're trying to do is try to assess this. But we do know that the leading, because the MNI is just starting, the Structural Genomics Consortium started about 2001 or so, the leading open science platform has exceedingly high reproducibility.
We have some minutes more. And
hello, Albrecht Hase from Physics and Neuroscience in Trento. I also have a question for you. How do your principles agree with the principles of your funders? Because here you said it's what has to be implemented at the level of the university. We already would fail because the money that is distributed to the university is strongly coupled to these classical parameters like impact factors of the journals that you are publishing in. So therefore, at the university level, we can't do much.
And so one of the first things the MNI has to struggle with, and they are doing, is changing their internal processes. It's not the external funding to do that. And McGill is as bad or worse than most North American universities in patenting and thinking that that's going to bring revenue when it doesn't. We've been total failure, but we've been doing it for 30 years, so since we've been a failure, let's do it more. But the MNI is standing alone, so they're fighting against the institution of which they're a part. And, you know, the funders they're talking to, are, the first people we talk to are the major philanthropies. So if you look at Gates, Wellcome Trust, and Chan Zuckerberg, those are fairly major in the health sciences, and they're on side. So we've worked with them. I'm being funded by Gates and Wellcome, and hopefully soon Chan Zuckerberg, because they see this as a way to make their investments more effective. We are working with the gold standard of of grants in any country, which is the national organizations, the governmental. To get them to change their peer review. That's going to be a longer process. But the principles were adopted with some conversations with them, but not, they went ahead anyway. What we've found since is that major pharmaceutical companies have come in and invested because we're open. So Johnson & Johnson, Takeda made investments in the MNI because they were open. They might not have made, there are other ones who continued their investments and increased them, but they had already been partners, so it's hard to tell whether they would have done that anyway. But the MNI has had new partners. Now again, there's the first mover question. Are they getting the funding because they're the first ones in the world to be completely open? Or is it because these firms are seeing this as the future, that they want the universities out of the intellectual property, and they see this as, for pharma, particularly as pre-competitive. So there are lots of things we don't know yet, but the principles were adopted and this is a leap of faith. And the goal is to demonstrate that it works. We don't know 100%, and we have to keep watching and so on, but early indications are good that the funders have been on side. Certainly the MNI has not lost funding, it's gained funding.
And so they're considering to give away the research to university and then just produce.
Yep. But they're the ones who started the Structural Genomics Consortium. They created the Structural Genomics Consortium, then they got the public money. In the pharma industry, they had the SNP Consortium, the single nucleotide polymorphisms, which was open as well. They were supporters of the Human Genome Project because to them, understanding the pathways of disease and finding potential targets is what's attractive. What was surprising to me is the biotech companies like this. I was thinking they wouldn't because they have a restrictive set of patents, but in fact they love it because it enables them to improve their products because they can use all the tools, It allows them to showcase themselves in front of the pharmaceutical companies. And we think it will improve, at least with not just open science for open sake, but within these consortia, the quality of the data, in which case they can go to pharma and say, you know, we're a member of this consortium, you can trust our results. And the other thing we have found is there's a study done, it's just preliminary at this point, of the Structural Genomics Consortium. So the data is made available to everyone at the same time. The companies that partners with the SGC, if you look at their patents, they cite the SGC literature a lot more. So it could be they're just doing this as a favor, but generally pharmas don't do favors. So we think it's actually meaning that they're able to extract value by being a member of the consortium than other people are, right? Because even if we give all our data free, knowledge is not free. You need to be in constant contact with the researchers. So there's a huge reason to be interacting with them. And so that's what's leading to investments.
Professor Balton has a comment or a question.
Well, yes, a comment or two comments. One of them is that I find it amazing that we are prepared to contemplate that someone should produce a published article without publishing the data. The modern era of science, which began in the 17th century, was founded on the principle that when you publish an idea, a concept, you publish the evidence, in other words, the data. Modern science wouldn't be where it is now if that hadn't been a fundamental rule. We've lost sight of it, and somehow it's become optional. And I regard a published paper that doesn't have access to the data and the metadata as myth, and no better. Go to the publishers and say that you should be the gatekeepers here. They say, oh, we're merely publishers. We don't have any responsibility for this. So there's another black mark against these blackguards of commercial publishers. I think the second one goes back to the issue of impact factors. But don't forget, 10 years ago, most of the world's science academies signed up to the San Francisco Declaration saying that we should drop impact factors completely. But we, academics, I'm afraid, connive with the publishers to put shackles around our wrists by perennially putting in referring to impact factors. It would be good for science if Science and Nature and other major journals became bankrupt, because we publish in Science because it's got a high impact. We should get rid of it. Science should go, Nature should go, all these journals should go. Why don't we do it? Because universities are dreadfully bad at organizing themselves. What we should be doing is getting some advice from trade union leaders showing us how to organize ourselves. We somehow suppose that we are internationally a rather weak body that can do nothing. Well, actually, we have the potential for enormous impact. What we should be doing is acting together. I mean, don't forget that the journals with the highest rate of retraction of articles are the high impact factor journals. Why? Because to get into Nature, you have to produce sexy science. In other words, you go further than the data will allow you. So, I mean, it's a really clear example of somewhere where we can have a real impact if we could work together.
Absolutely, and I just don't understand why the universities, as I say, we have a proof of concept. We publish our own law journals, the universities pay for them. Why don't they get into the publishing business themselves and do a better job of doing all these things that they should do? It is logical, and the cost would be much less, and the impact and the profits in the sense of results, not just money, would be huge.
We should stop to be reviewer for high impact factor journals. Maybe that might be a solution.
Okay. Other question?
I do have another question. What about the dark side of open science? Is there any dark side, or?
Yes. We don't know what it is yet. I'm sure we'll discover it.
I know it. Elsevier.
No, but that's not. But I think the question is, if we actually do open science, what would be the dark side? And I'm sure there are going to be negative consequences. Every human institution creates negative. I mean, the one thing we're terrible at is actually knowing the consequences of our actions. I mean, I teach an innovation course, and I go back to Samaria, where they kept irrigating the land more and more, and the population grew, so they took over more land until everything was salted and everybody had to leave. And we've done that every time. When we come up with new technology, when IBM did not believe that the computer would be widely used. Televisions came out, people said, who is going to sit in front of a box and watch this stuff, right? So we know there'll be negative consequences. I have no idea what they are.
Just one comment about what Professor was saying. Maybe I was wondering whether you are considering to expand this more broader, like worldwide, to ensure that your data will at least, let's say, declare to be used in an ethical way. Yeah. And my second comment, it's totally unrelated. I was curious about the town hall meetings. In one of your slides, you said that you made town hall meetings, and I don't know whether if you can comment on this, because I was wondering whether you are presenting your initiative as something which is good for patients, let's say, but on the other hand, you should not give to people false hopes about, let's say, this is going to cure your disease in two or 3 years, or 1 month, or 1 day. Thanks.
Yeah. I was not part of the town halls. I'm not at the MNI, so I did not witness them in person. I did talk to them about it. It was mostly to get the staff involved. I think the MNI, I think they did have some conversations with patients, likely not enough, but these were internal for researchers, especially those in clinical labs who were worried, to inform them about this change that they were proposing and what did people think and what were their worries. So it was a conversation within the walls of the MNI. The conversations with patients was more ad hoc, and I think in the future, if I were to suggest someone to redo it, is to make that more explicit. And we know that patients are really excited about open science, but worried that we will put up walls that will exclude them. So we have to do that. The first part of your question was what? Right. It's an open question of how we do it. First of all, you have different rules around the world. It is possible in some countries to use the data to do experiments that we would not approve of. I'm not sure there's a way to stop that. But we can control the data we collect and how we disseminate it. So we're thinking of a two-tiered structure for the data. One is you collect all the data, the samples, etc. There's a committee that has access to the raw data. They anonymize it to the extent that anonymization makes sense, and makes that publicly available. And then in 5 or 10 years, when a researcher says, the data I need is not in there, that committee can go back and query the original data set and samples, pull it out and republish it. And so the hope is there's some level of protection. But if your question is more about unethical uses in some far-off country, no. But I don't think there is a limit, frankly, today.
Okay. Thanks a lot. Before closing the session, I have a very small question for Jerry Reichman about the. You said that we have to change copyright law, but at the same time, it's very difficult for the international process of rulemaking. In your opinion, what is the role of the teaching? Because in teaching intellectual property, copyright law, because probably, you know, in Italy, we usually we interpret the exception and limitation in very strict way. And this is the opposite of the idea of user rights. But at the same time, I think we have many, many legal tools to open the interpretation. For example, with the connection with fundamental rights, and in particular the right to access knowledge. And we have many, many constitutional norms at the national and European Union level. At the same time, the European Union Court of Justice said copyright law is not an absolute right, and we can balance copyright with other fundamental rights. So I think we have many, many tools as in professor, in doctrine, scholarship, to change. But this is essentially a question of mentality. The way how we teach copyright law. And in Italy, but not only in Italy, there is a very, very traditional way to teach copyright in the sense of very, very strong right, absolute right, and therefore it's impossible to imagine to build user rights, because user rights are limited by the exclusive right.
Well, I think we do a better job of that, both in the copyright law and patent law. That is, when we teach it, we look at both sides and emphasize the public interest components and how to protect them as well as the private interest. I think most of our better schools go out of our way to do that. The problem is the one that I would have dwelled on more in latter parts of the paper, is that to the extent that you need changes in the law, you won't get them, because the publishing industry spends so much money and the legislative process is so corrupt and susceptible to that kind of influence that it becomes very, very difficult to do. Now, having said that, there were periods when the public interest people collaborated. When the WIPO copyright treaty was negotiated, there was a fantastic coalition of public interest negotiators. We all worked together. We were all there when the treaty was negotiated. And the reason you have Article 10, and the reason that Article 10 is expressly understood to allow fair use, is that we were in constant contact, the National Academy, were in constant contact with the Vice President's office, and the Vice President said either you put it in or the American delegation will come home. So, but without this kind of building up political impact, you can't do it, because they have the money, and the money talks when it comes to legislation. Now, the question is, to what extent can open science circumvent the need for that kind of money, because you're taking it away, but you're up against the as you say, well, but the system at the end of the day wants impact factors, so what are you going to do? That's why I think you have to organize it from the top. You have to that's where your suggestion is so important. The universities need to collaborate and get together and have universal policies, and it has to be part of their function and part of their funding apparatus. And if that happens, there will be money, okay, because the pharmaceutical companies are dependent on upstream research, okay? Let's not forget this. They don't do upstream research. They want you to believe they do upstream research, but what they do is clinical trials, but they don't do upstream research. So if the universities get together and make the right sort of approach, they will be funded.
Okay. Professor Bolton?
Mind if I ask, you mentioned when you were asking the question yourself, a human right of access to knowledge. Where is that located? Where is that stated?
You have the human rights, or
it's in the UN
UN Declaration.
Declaration,
but it's also in the social economic rights. I can't remember.
Yeah.
So the Universal Declaration has access to education.
But the other one, the one on social has knowledge.
Rights of science for all.
Yeah.
Rights of science for
What it
all.
means
Rights
is-
of the benefits of science for all. It's
Yeah.
very vague,
Very vague.
but declarations have been made and exist and need to be trundled out and used more.
At the national level, we have also the Article 9 of our Constitution, and it's possible to interpret the article as a tool to access knowledge. So we can have a break. Yeah, please.
One important limitation that I want to emphasize is the difference between the common law and the civil law countries, because you were saying about the relationship between education and practice. Well, in the civil law countries, you can, especially where there's a fair use provision, you can make these cases, these public interest cases, and the judge has some leeway. But there is this civil law tradition that the judge must apply the law as it's written, whatever that means, I don't know. And you don't have the legal legal realist tradition to have.
Except in Quebec and in Scotland.
Yeah.
I think the situation is changing a lot.
Changing there.
Yeah.
I think
Also
it
in
is.
Italy.
I
Also in
think
Italy.
it is
Because
changing.
okay, we can have a break of 30 minutes, and then we can start with the second session of the conference. Thank you. 25 minutes. We can start at 11:30.
That was extremely interesting.
Shall we resume the session, please? Thank you. Let me briefly recap what we have heard so far. Professor Reichmann told us about the tension, or better the collision, between the revolutionary knowledge that now allows the greatest development of science and the legal impediments that really endangers this development. But he also explained how harsh this collision can be when we think that a large part of the research is publicly funded. This is true also in the field of life science, where automated knowledge and computational analysis is reaching particularly impressive results. The next speaker will bring this discourse even further. He's Professor Geoffrey Bolton from the University of Edinburgh. He's a Regius Professor of Geology, and beyond his research interest in climate change and its impact on Earth, he also served as a distinguished chair of the Working Group on Open Science of the Royal Society. And he contributed to the very important report of 2012 about open science, science as an open enterprise, open data for open science. So please, Professor, you may present his work. Use this.
Buongiorno a tutti. È un piacere di visitare Trento per la prima volta, ma spero che non è l'ultima volta. Ho comprato una memoria del mercato di Trento. Okay, well, I'm afraid that's all my Italian, all gone. So I'm a geologist, and therefore I like pictures, so please excuse me. I'm also, as it happens, the president of a body called CoData, which for 50 years has been the International Commission on Data for Science and Technology. And it has adapted its priorities to the way in which technology has changed, the way in which scientific priorities have changed, and also the way in which the social organization of science has changed. But I'm going to try to talk about, as it says, universities and open science. And the large question, of course, is how is the networked Earth that we now all live in, whether we like it or not, how is that and the university related? And those of you that are observant will see this university is almost 1,000 years old. Of course, it's Bologna. So this is this extraordinary transformation that took place almost 20 years ago now, when for the first time digital means of storing data replaced analog means, with two great advantages. Firstly, they were much cheaper, and secondly, much more flexible. And as it happens, in 2003, for the first time, the human genome was sequenced. It had taken 10 years and cost $4 billion. Now it takes 1.5 days, and it costs less than $1,000. And that's a consequence of this extraordinary shift that's taken place. And indeed, if one were to look at the digital explosion that has occurred and took this graph not to 2007, but 2018, you would find that this room would have to be 10 times higher to accommodate the graph. And this extraordinary digital revolution has 4 major components. First of all, we're now able to almost any device with power of its own is able to acquire non-trivial information about its environment. Secondly, we have an amazing capacity to store data, which is increasing annually, and although some have suggested it might shortly come to an end, there's no technological reason why that should happen, apart from whether the amount of electricity available on Earth will permit it to happen. The third component are the enormously expanded capacities of computation, and of course the growing importance of artificial intelligence procedures, particularly machine learning, which have infiltrated into many, if not most, areas of science. And by the way, by science, I mean all of us. You lawyers are scientists as well. It's not just natural science. It's all. I think someone defined it once as a structured approach to knowledge that is both rationally explicable and practically exploitable, which I like. And of course, the fourth element is the web and communications devices which access the web, which have given us an extraordinary capacity for almost everyone on Earth to access information no matter where it comes from. And what we must realize, this is a world historical event. And I justify that by this statement at the top, which I think is self-evident, that the technologies by which knowledge is acquired and stored and communicated have always been essential drivers of human, material, and social progress. And I think an interesting analogy is Johannes Gutenberg's invention of metallic movable type, which in part destroyed the business model of the medieval monastery, but although he didn't realize it, it went on, because of the reduction in cost, to enhance literacy throughout Europe. It was a driver for the development of formal educational systems. It had a massive impact on trade. It changed the way in which states governed themselves, and arguably it had a major impact on religion. And living in Trentino, Tridentium, you should need no reminder of that. And of course, what we now see is an extraordinary event which is engaging and influencing really all parts of society. So why open data? And I'll talk about open data first, then go on to open science. And I bring in evidence 3 people. Arthur Koestler, who refers to self-correction. And that is the idea that provided your data is made open and available so that the evidence for whatever you claim to be true, then that can be scrutinized and tested by others. And this lovely statement, which you might be able to read, the progress of science is strewn like an ancient desert trail with the bleached skeletons of discarded theories that once seemed to possess eternal life. Beautiful. And George Bernard Shaw, the Irish playwright, who argued that, of course, if you have a physical object and you exchange them, you still have one physical object each. But if you have an idea and exchange that, then you've got two ideas. And that's about efficiency and productivity. And then Richard Feynman, one of the greatest physicists of the last century, if we had the sense to share all our separate data about all that we know, and combine them in intelligent ways, then science, that is knowing, would have come of age. Now, why does Feynman's comment matter? Well, my principal reason for saying it is that big data is interesting. Broad data is much more interesting. What the digital revolution has done is not only to create these vast and rapid fluxes of big data, but also an enormous diversity of data, some big and some small. And the interesting possibility is that we might be able to combine and integrate data from all these various data sources, so-called broad data. And what that does is to permit us to do something that science has never really been able to do before. In the past, most of the science we've done, no matter how complex it might look, has actually been rather simple science, where the direction of causality is one way. One of the things we've been largely unable to do is to characterize complexity. If we utilize different data streams which bear upon the same phenomenon from a different perspective, then for the first time we're able to characterize complexity in a much richer way than we ever have before. But the crucial thing, if we're going to do that, is that we must not have paywalls or IP walls. Otherwise, all you can do is own one or two data streams. What you really need is access to as many as you can. And so I think the fundamental revolution, which is in part a business model revolution, is away from owning a little data to accessing a lot of data, which means the costs must be minimal. Now, the big issue for science, the big opportunity for the sort of science I do, and I suspect one person on the front bench here does, and maybe one or two others of you, is that for the last 60 years after the invention of the modern computer, for the first time we were able to simulate the dynamics of complex systems. And by complex systems, I mean those systems that have emergent properties. That is to say, you cannot predict the operation of the system by looking at just one of its components, because they're coupled, they interact. A affects B and B affects A. And this is a fractal, which is simply a 6-component coupled system. Doesn't matter which it is. But recently, over the last few years, because of this flood of broad data, we've been able to characterize complexity as well as simulate it. And the consequence is that by coupling the two together, we can look at complex phenomena not simply to characterize their state, but also to simulate their evolution and then recapitulate the state and so on, have a full evolving understanding of complex issues. And the important thing to recognize that most of the major global challenges that we now identify are embedded in complex systems. The problem is a simple one, and that is, whereas integrated modeling is now the norm, we put different models together and make them work together, integrating data is very difficult. Why? Simply because the different disciplines that produce the data have different standards, they use incompatible vocabularies, and their ontologies don't work together. So though we'd like to, we can't. This is one example where it has happened, it's been done, and what one finds is that within relatively tight disciplinary silos, one can integrate data because people have worked to do it. This is an image of the surface circulation of the North Atlantic. It's an image we've never seen before. This is Florida, this is the east coast of America, that's Labrador. It's not a picture. It wasn't taken by a camera. It's the integration of data from about a dozen satellites, all of which exploit different parts of the electromagnetic spectrum. And by integrating data, we see this amazing complexity, which has now become fundamental to models of weather and climate and the way in which oceans and the climate interact. What we would like to do is to apply it to other complex phenomena, but phenomena which bridge a much bigger disciplinary range. The human future is an urban future. Why? Because almost all the population growth takes place in urban areas. The growth of major cities of more than 10 million people has exploded. One of the things we need to understand is how do cities operate as organisms? If we knew that, then organizing, planning, developing what have been called smart cities becomes much, much, much easier. What do we need to know in order to be able to do that? We need to be able to integrate a whole series of data sources that come from from civic archives, from scientific information, from the social sciences, from law, from natural sciences, and so on. Can we do it? No, we can't. One of the interesting things, of course, is just about the only institutions on earth that comprise a range of expertise of that sort are universities. And it's interesting that we don't use it. We create many universities called faculties of law, or faculties of physics, or faculties of the humanities. We don't put it all together in the way that Richard Feynman suggests we ought to. Another one, which is again a sustainable development goal for good health and well-being, is integrating data in relation to infectious disease. The vectors which account for the development and spread, and indeed are important for the control of infection, are quite complex. It's not a question merely of the biology of the infecting agent and the biology of the subject. And there's a major program now run under the auspices of the International Science Council, which is the premier representative body of international science. It's the body which represents science at the United Nations. And that is to utilize its members, who are all the disciplinary international bodies, the physicists and the lawyers and others, to ask them the question, have you got your data in order? Is it well orchestrated? Is it well understood in ways that it can be integrated? And there's a major project of data integration starting now, which is going to take about 10 years to complete. And this is one of the pilots within that project. It's based on a publication produced by a body called Science International, which is the combination of the key international representative bodies of science, which argued that which set out what it suggested were the responsibilities of scientists, their institutions, of publishers, as funders, and so on, where the boundaries of openness lie, because that is important, and the sorts of practices which are a necessary prerequisite to having effective open procedures. Now, open science is an interesting phrase, and the immediate thing that comes to my mind is open to whom? Now, the European Union has decided what open science is, and it's decided that it is open data plus open access publishing. Well, for me, that's just scientists talking to other scientists, but more efficiently. Africa has taken a bit of a lead. This December, there will be launched an African open science platform, which includes what Europe is doing, but actually involves citizens in a really fundamental way, and not just citizen scientists, all citizens, NGOs and citizen groups. It's important to realize that, of course, that Africa is a big place. You can put all the other continents onto the map of Africa and they all fit in. Italy's up here and we're just about there. So Europe is a small place and it has this rather conservative approach. Africa's a much larger place and it's being much bolder. And I just hope that Africa beats us. Why should one involve the public more broadly? And that is that we scientists fool ourselves. We fool ourselves that the things that we discover, the facts that we believe we create, actually influence the public. Well, to an alarming degree, they don't. You take on sort of key issues, climate change, AIDS, vaccination, smoking, and you ask how effective has scientific knowledge been? And the answer is much, much less effective than it might have been. Why not? Because actually, we don't understand as scientists what it is that causes people to make up their minds. We think that somehow facts trump emotions. Well, actually, emotions trump facts. 200 years ago, the Scottish philosopher David Hume said it beautifully. He said, reason is the child of passion. And he was dead right. And we've got to get used to the idea, and we've got to come out beyond our library and laboratory doors and engage with a much broader public. But of course, as someone hinted earlier today, there's a dark side to all this. to the digital revolution. We've seen evidence of political manipulation. Privacy is and has been invaded and will be invaded more. Cybercrime, I mean, I get about 6 attempts to take my bank details away every week. Cyber warfare is being developed. Autonomous weaponry is already being utilized in the field. Not only are weapons able to choose their targets, but actually they also choose their strategies. And of course, such autonomy, machine autonomy, asks the question, do we suffer from existential risk? Now, it's easy to say such big issues like this are for governments and for security services and the like. My view is actually these are social issues, and if we in universities are a social agent, we ought to be in there as well. We should be prodding them, and we shouldn't simply take the protestations of governments and their security services at face value. So there are a lot of challenges in this so-called digital revolution. I've mentioned integrating data. Standards of reproducibility have already been mentioned. Open access publishing, fair data, but there are profound issues for society as well, and we should be part of the process of engaging with society and addressing them. First one is managing the world's data. Many believe, and I'm certainly one of them, and I suspect some of you, if not most of you already are, that our planet is in a bit of a crisis, or we living on it, in a bit of a crisis of sustainability, which we have to address. If in 20 years' time, we haven't been systematically accumulating the data from all parts of planet Earth, which demonstrates how it's moving, then our successors will curse us. It's something we have to start doing now. Machine learning results are neither predictable nor explicable. In other words, you can't ask the question why. That's a fundamental issue for the scientific method, and it's also fundamental for society. Why should I, as an ordinary member of society, believe a scientist who tells me this is so without being able to ask the question why? It's knowledge without understanding. Autonomous systems I've mentioned. Some have argued that AI will make us rich beyond belief. We'll be pampered but purposeless. Unless, of course, we're extinguished by it, and so on. And there's education and the role of the university. One of the key issues, in my view, that has been hinted at this morning, I think, is the whole idea that science ought to be, or might not be, a public enterprise. I think it was captured in the comment that there should be a human right of access to knowledge. Well, one of the dangers that we face through the burgeoning technology companies is the privatization of knowledge, which I'll come back to. So these are some of the questions that Roberto Caso set. I'm going to try to answer them, not directly, but in broad terms, and hopefully you might even agree. The last one is particularly interesting. Does open science represent a bulwark of university autonomy and academic freedom? My view is we should put that the other way around. What is autonomy and academic freedom going to do for the obvious need for open science? We might just be lazy, both as institutions and individuals. Let's hope we're not. So who are the stakeholders in this whole digital transformation whereby the knowledge that we acquire and the way we use it is now a massive digital phenomenon? They're clearly the technology companies. They're universities, because knowledge and information have been our staple diet for the last 1,000 years. It's science too, and the reason I separate science from universities is because we as scientists not only have an allegiance to the institutions that employ us, but we have an allegiance to each other. A geologist in Hokkaido or Honshu or Australia or Alaska, I have a fellow feeling with them, and the same is true of other scientists. And they are a separate community in some ways. States, of course, have a fundamental concern. Some states have been creating national strategies to be able to cope with this phenomenon to their benefit. Others have been rather slow to do so. And of course, ultimately, it's civic society and citizens who will bear the consequence of what happens, and the implications of the actions of the other players in this game. So what have been the trends in relation to all these players, all these stakeholders? Well, one interesting one is at the top, what's happened with the web. And I think that history is never so enlightening as when it shows us what people wrongly expected to happen in the near future. If you remember, about a decade ago, we expected that the web would democratize information. It would inhibit monopolies. In other words, rather than being monopoly of thought, there would be lots of centers of thinking and creativity. And it would fragment audiences in that way. In fact, what's happened, it's strengthened monopolies. It's polarized audiences, and it's indifferent to truth or falsehood. I read a book by a distinguished British economist recently who wrote that the invention of the web has produced the most powerful machine ever for the propagation of lies. And of course, it's obviously right, and amongst other things. So what's been happening? Well, in government, we see that power has been eking away from governments internationally into the private sector, sometimes corruptly, sometimes not. The public good enterprises are increasingly shifting from governments to markets, and policymaking is subverted by so-called alternative facts. Technology companies have been enormous. They dominate the online presence, and the fact that they are the means whereby retail goods are identified and sold means that they dominate the retail industry in effect. An impact that we'd never expected. And of course, they're arguably already privatizing knowledge, as we've heard this morning, and the potential is for them to privatize education as well. Universities, I would argue, have expanded in size, but they've shrunk in purpose. We've become instrumental to the policies of government rather than having ideas of our own. Open science is a powerful new paradigm, as we've heard this morning, but my question again is, how open is open? It ought to be more open than currently we conceive of it. What about citizens? Well, many of us are locked in what I call self-reinforcing echo chambers, like Facebook, that just feed me what they believe I want to see. We see nationalist populism, maybe even in Italy, I don't know, but certainly elsewhere in Europe and beyond. And the question is that inimical to international sharing of information, data, and ideas? Maybe it is. 5 minutes. So, universities and the digital revolution. Here are some predictions for you. The UK Institute of Public Policy in 2013, the classical buildings of great universities may look permanent, but the storms of change now threaten them. Ernst & Young, that paragon of veracity, truthfulness, and prediction, 1,000-year-old industry and the cups of change. Higher education is next for all this. And the World Bank, higher education is the next big private enterprise opportunity. So I'm afraid, in the terms that someone living in Glasgow would know very well, we're all doomed. But we do have some important attributes. First of all, we have, and scientists within universities, have greater public trust than almost anyone else, still, notwithstanding the idea somehow that we have a crisis of trust. We educate the next generation. It's almost as if we've forgotten that. We help to form the minds of the people who will make the decision makers in 10 or 15 years' time. Don't forget it and use it. Not to subvert them, but to ensure their minds are open. We employ the majority of public-funded scientists. We generate knowledge across the whole of the spectrum, quite unlike any other body. And also, it's still true that academics hold, or in consortia, still curate most of the corpus of rigorous scientific data. The data that Google has isn't like that. It has some, but not very much. Most of it is still within the hands of scientists. So the debate for the university is pretty simple. What do we think we are? Do we take an instrumental view? We're just like a supermarket. We have some goods on the shelves, and consumers come in and take the goods off as they wish. and in particular their specific skills for the labour market and were parcel research products of business innovation. But actually, they're precisely the skills that machine learning will replace. So why are we focusing on them? This is dear old Charlie Chaplin in his film Modern Times of the 1930s, who understood, as you see here, what it was like to be contained within a machine. Well, we're almost part of the machine now. But then there's the classical view of the university. From Drew Faust, just stood down as president of Harvard, Ben Okri, the great Nigerian novelist, and interesting Michael Higgins, who's currently president of Ireland. The life-enhancing skills such as creativity, clarity of thought and expression, are the skills that will be essential for the citizens of the future in adapting to and creating using a new technological world. That's the domain we should be exploiting. So why aren't we in it? Well, let me give you one quick example from a meeting last week, a UN convened meeting of a relatively small group of about 40 people in Paris. It was driven because the UN had called upon Google, Amazon, and Elon Musk to suggest how the UN might be instrumental in supporting and governing the world's data in a world where sustainability is an absolutely central issue. And what came out from them was that there was important that the responsibilities for this development should pass from governments and funders to investors and markets. And the sustainable business model are required in order to support that new sector. Some of us proposed an antithesis, an antithesis, that upstream IP should not be private in relation to observations of the characteristics of the Earth, that this proposal completely ignored existing time series, whether it was either from space, things like Landsat imagery, or it was the enormous amounts of data contained in scientific databases about the Earth. The principal burden would be, or the principal driver of this would be private sector investment. And the key question was whether the purpose was primarily to get a return on investment or primarily driven by the perception of sustainability, because they're rather different purposes with different processes. So we then suggested an alternative which was eventually adopted, grudgingly I have to say, but nonetheless adopted by the UN representatives. The purpose should be to support global management towards sustainability. It needed global governance for databases. So for example, we identified a series of domains, data domains. One of them, for example, the biosphere. A consortium of international life scientists have put together what they believe is more or less the 100 top core resources for the biosciences that we need to have. And one of the things that the International Science Council is currently doing is asking all the other groups, what are the core resources for your area of understanding? And something that was mentioned, and it mirrors a little discussion we had this morning, the possibility of access to knowledge as a human right. If that could be embedded in the Universal Declaration, one of the things it might do is make the privatization of knowledge just a little more difficult than otherwise it might be. So what's my final statement? Well, first of all, knowledge and science are quintessentially public enterprises and must and should remain so unless we decide we want to lose our humanity. The world faces a crisis of sustainability and a converging set of socioeconomic, political and cultural challenges, and the digital revolution offers potential for powerful new solutions. That many practices of researchers and institutions are adapted to old paper technologies that are a barrier to exploiting these opportunities of the digital revolution, which are for the public good. And that universities have a unique potential and, what's more, a responsibility to respond to those challenges. And they should do so. They should be bold, they should show leadership and responsibility, and crucially, a greater sense of themselves. Not just, what does the Italian state or the British state require of you? We all know what they require of you. It's about GDP and producing the next generation of wage slaves. What do we want? What we think is important to the future? And we should say so. Because frankly, if we don't confront that challenge, it would be seen as an existential failure. They might as well shut us down. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Bolton. We will postpone the discussion later, okay? Like we did before. But before, Thomas, do you want to use your... Let me say something before I introduce you. Earlier this morning, Professor Gold was talking about the importance of handling the data well, and this was confirmed by Professor Bolton as well. And now the next speaker, Dr. Thomas Margoni, will precisely talk about the challenge of data ownership, and he will explain in details what we mean by being very careful in this handling of data. Thomas is a senior lecturer at the University of Glasgow, create and also director of the LLM program in Glasgow as well. He has been very active in open science, and he takes part in different initiatives both at the European and international level that promotes open science, including Open-Minded and now Open Air Advance. Please, Thomas.
Thank you very much for the very kind introduction. I hope to live up with the expectations of such introduction. I think that most of my intervention today will be of a more legal nature, and what I will try to do is to understand. So we discussed a lot during the first panel and during the first part of this second panel about the role of data in our economy, society, and in science. So as a lawyer, I think one of the questions we should ask ourselves is whether and how data is owned or can be owned, or it's already owned nowadays following the applicable rules, mainly in certain areas. I'll be focusing mostly, if not exclusively, on copyright law. And one of the basic tenets of copyright law is that facts, or at least copyright theory, is that facts, principles, data as such are not protected. We can identify these principles everywhere in international and national sources. A main element could be seen in, for example, the originality principle, or in the fact that only intellectual creations or intellectual productions can be protected by copyright, meaning that there needs to be some sort of human ingenuity in that activity. A mere fact cannot be protected by copyright. It would be common sense, I would dare to say, that creating a property right over a fact might have very anti-competitive effects without really rewarding anything, because there is no investment, no personality to protect in mere factual information. But international legislation goes a step further and at the TRIPS and WCT level, so two of the main international conventions, it is clarified that, again, principles, data as such, facts are not protected by copyright law. So we should be somehow, we should feel relieved, at least so far, that data, so such an important element in our economy, society, science, is not protected. There are other areas of law that I will not be discussing in detail, which could say something about data protection or data ownership. Trade secrets, contracts, data protection, legislations that at different level may regulate how certain data it's protected or its circulation somehow regulated, but this it's done usually either very sector specific or with tools that and remedies that are not as strong or pervasive as a full property right would be. That said, I will focus mostly on corporate theory and corporate law, because other areas, well, are certainly very interesting, but is not what I really covered, and I do think that some of the most interesting development in the field belong to the first part. So we say that corporate theory and corporate law says no, that it's not protected. However, if we take a closer look, we see that some jurisdictions offer some sort of protection to data. Professor Reichman this morning already explained us how the European Union protects data to a certain extent. In 1996, it created a database directive that, as any other legislation or most legislations across the world, protects databases when they are original in the infrastructure, so not the data, just the infrastructure, when it is original enough. However, in the EU, because we thought that we had to somehow incentivize the investment in database productions because we were falling behind the US, which, by the way, we know they don't protect non-original databases, we created this sui generis database right for non-original databases when there is a substantial investment in obtaining, verifying, or presenting them. It's very complex wording to say that actually when there is a lot of investment because you pay someone to collect data, because you verify that data, because you present that data properly, then you do have a property right protecting not the single data, but a substantial part of this data. Which is a first interesting element, because I thought that corporate theory and corporate law at the international level said no. But if we take a closer look, we say, well, you know, in Europe at least, and I think it's only Europe and South Korea who offer this kind of non-original protection, there is a form of protection for data. Now, the interesting thing is that both the directive and the UCJ, so the European Court of Justice, clarified that it has to be data which is either obtained, verified, or presented. If you create that data, then you don't obtain any form of protection, because this would be highly anti-competitive. You would create single-source databases monopolies, which is bad. This was clarified through a number of cases. We don't have the time to go, or possibly the interest to go through those. But this is why other jurisdictions, actually the same one, the European Union, has considered, and fortunately dropped for the moment, the idea of creating a new right in data. So not in databases, as we have it right now, but actually in the production of data. This was a proposal that emerged in a communication by DG Connect around 2015-2016. Since then, that proposal has disappeared from the agenda, and we believe at the moment nothing is happening, but I think it's quite telling of the direction that legislation in this sector is taking, the fact that we did have this proposal. Just to be clear, this proposal was heavily lobbied by EU data producers, mainly the automotive industry, because they collect huge amount of data, and you know, in the words of the at the time European Commissioner, we did not know their legal status. Data are the gold of the future, principally in the automotive sector. Where modern sensor-equipped cars automatically generate and collect large amount of data on traffic and roads conditions, engine performance, etc., etc. These machine-generated sensors data have enormous value, for example, for developing self-driving automobiles. But it is unclear who owns this data, the automobile manufacturer, the car owner, the producers of the sensors equipment, or no one at all. What we need are rules at the EU level that establish data ownership. So while we can find this statement reasonable until the last sentence, the conclusion that we need data ownership it doesn't really follow logically. I mean, we do have an issue with data, but why do we need data ownership? That's a non sequitur. So we could say, well, okay, that's fine. This is more or less what we have. We don't really have property rights over data, but you know, in the EU we have this database protection, database directive that offer protection to certain data. But the truth is that if we take a closer look, and as you can see from the dense wording in this slide, we need to take a closer look. In the EU especially, data is already protected as a matter of fact. The EU corporate law doesn't really say that explicitly, but what it really means is, yes, we are protecting data. Otherwise, we wouldn't need a text and data mining exception to extract data, right? I mean, if data is not protected, we don't need an exception. If we need an exception, it's because something is protected. This is a logical statement. So for the very same fact that we do need a text and data mining exception at the EU level to cover most but not all activities, implies that data is actually protected, at least in the digital environment. How did this happen? Because international sources and corporate theory tell us that no, data is not protected. It happened because of, I would say, design flaw in how EU corporate law has been created. The design principle was to harmonize broadly rights. This was done in different areas, but mainly for what it's important right now, Article 2, 3, and 4 of the InfoSoc Directive, which means right of reproduction, right of redistribution, and right of communication to the public, including making available. These rights, in legalese, we call them rules of maximum harmonization because they are broad, they are mandatory, they don't leave much space to member state to deviate from what has been legislated in there, and are quite strong. However, these strong rights were not balanced by an equally strong set of exceptions. This is the same old story, but Article 5, as we all know, contains the exceptions and limitations that can be implemented by EU member states, but of the 21 more or less that are listed, none of them, except for one, are mandatory, meaning that each member state can cherry pick with the result that cross-European, cross-border uses, such as in most scientific field, is not really aided by this legislative design. But it's a closed list, meaning that member state cannot add new exceptions. So if a member state wants to add a text and data mining exception, perhaps they can do it, and they have done it in a few countries, UK, Germany, France, Estonia, but only within the limits of the exception for research and study, meaning chiefly non-commercial. So what happens out of this balance, the interplay between a very strong set of rights, especially a right of reproduction that says any reproduction in whole or in part, direct or indirect, permanent or temporary. So this statement means that browsing the internet is a corporate infringement because of the temporary copy that you make in your cache memory. This is what Article 2 means. This design was, let's protect everything and identify specific area that we want to allow. Browsing the internet was something that in 2001 the European legislator thought deserving, so they created Article 5.1. Exception for temporary acts of reproduction that are incidental or transient, that do not own an independent economic meaning, that are part of a lawful process or of a communication between parties and an intermediary. A lot of very specific conditions to be met. It means that Article 5.1 makes your internet browsing not a corporate infringement. But the main problem of this design, of this legislative technique, is that you can only allow what you're aware of. In 2001, you're aware as a legislator of internet, there is a certain thing called internet, and you can create an exception to allow it. In 2001, you were not aware of the importance of, say, data or text and data mining or machine learning. And therefore, this exception is not really suitable to cover those uses with a very limited set of exceptions in certain specific areas that we can discuss, but it's not a real solution. It turns out that because in order to extract data from publications, from databases, regardless what is your activity, you need to make some sort of copy. That copy is an infringement, is an infringing copy. So my problem is, well, you're telling me that data is not protected, but you're telling me that any possible activity that I have to put in place to use that data is an infringement. So, well, then I guess either we are overly formalistic and we accept this nonsense, or we have to say that either EU law is not compliant with international obligations, or something has changed. I do think that something has changed because this structure, this design, that it's a clear, I say, implicit or explicit presumption in favor of protection of investment against innovation, is what is corporate law nowadays. Corporate law wasn't about investment and innovation. It used to be about creativity, originality, and access. I think that this has disappeared. Nowadays, corporate law and corporate lawmaking is about investment on the one side and innovation on the other. To anyone who has participated in the recent 2-3 years of discussion at the EU level for the new proposal for a corporate and a digital single market, it should appear quite clear that words such as authors and users were seldom pronounced. What we discussed about, and what all this probably is about to a certain extent at least, is to protect investment against innovation that is driven by a different player than the one who invested in the creation, in the specific case of data. Now, this is particularly important at the European level because when we say investment, we mean European investments made by European firms, let's call them, for the moment, without giving away the final of this story. But when we talk about innovation, we usually mean US innovation. Because the big players, the big platforms that really are extremely successful in exploiting the value of this data are not Europeans, are mostly American, are Google, Facebook, the usual culprits. Why this is so relevant for open science or for science in general? Because if we agree, and you may disagree, but if you agree with me so far that, as a matter of fact, data is protected already, and the direction, if anything, is towards more protection, and if we agree, and I think that for what we heard this morning, that the new directions, the real new promising direction of science is mostly in the field of artificial intelligence, machine learning, deep learning, neural networks. I'm not really sure about what is the exact meaning of the last two examples, but if the direction is this one, if not all, but most of this innovation, most of these algorithms needs to be trained on data in order to acquire knowledge. But if data is owned, then it means that AI and the future of science and open science is actually, if not owned, at least controlled by who has property rights over data. And this situation, which in my opinion is the law right now, is not the outcome of a very carefully and deeply considered public policy analysis. We never discussed this. It's simply the outcome of a design flaw, because in 2001 we thought that you know, it's pretty good to protect a lot, Article 2, and we create specific exceptions to allow the uses that we are aware deserve to be lawful, the internet. We never even thought, in 2001, probably you can help me, was there even the concept of artificial, well, probably it existed, but was it so developed as it is nowadays that a legislator could have considered it? If it was, certainly not by the EU legislator. If you take the preparatory works behind the InfoSoc directive, machine learning, unsurprisingly, it's not mentioned. So we are in a situation where, at least in Europe, we are actually, or let's put it in the most objective form I can, we have a very strong legislative presumption that in order to develop any artificial intelligence application that needs to be trained on data, you need permission. This is the European situation at the moment. Is this situation the same as in other parts of the world? It's not. Jerry explained to us how important is fair use in the States. And we can see, if we go back to this balance that I was talking about, we can see fair use as a proper counterbalance to strong rights. We can have strong rights, but the stronger the rights, the stronger has to be the counterbalance in order to have a balanced solution. A balanced solution that can offer the right set of incentives and protection, but without exceeding in that direction, because we need something, an exception, a standard that allows innovation and access and distribution of that knowledge. Fair use has been very successful in doing this in the US. We don't have that in Europe. We have a closed list of non-mandatory exceptions. This is the reason why, in my opinion, the question is wrong. So to all of those of you who have followed again the proposal for a new copyright directive, the concept of value gaps should be familiar. This is the concept behind Article 11, press publishers' right, and Article 13, so the idea of creating, proposal, not an idea anymore, to impose filtering obligations on certain intermediaries. And the rationale, it's because we have to protect European publishers in the case of press publishers' rights, and European right holders in the case of Article 13 from US platforms who are able to capture the value of that information, knowledge, IP, without really producing them. The question should be, in my opinion, why are all the platforms based in the US and not in Europe? Why don't we have a European Google? Why don't we have a European Facebook? Why Europe is not producing innovation, but is just protecting investments? That, I think, is the real question. And I'm not saying that the only simple answer is fair use. That probably would be not correct. There are many other things that influence innovation policy environment. But certainly, what Google, Facebook, and the like have been doing, especially when they were a startup, so didn't have the money to pay, very good lawyers, in Europe would have most likely been copyright infringement. So if you have to decide where to start up your company, you don't choose the EU. So this is what mostly I wanted to tell you. And I do understand that it affects, so data ownership problems affect not only open science, but science in general. But in this sense, the more data ownership we have, the more we develop towards a scientific environment that is not open, that does not comply with the principle of open science. I think that all this, which is a bit theoretical, has a very good example, and I do have a set of slides that probably I don't have the time to go through.
You do, actually, 7 minutes.
7 minutes. I can do 1 minute per slide, but this is basically, never gonna happen, is the example, it's just one example that I wanted to give to you of how all that I explained, the story that I told you, has just happened in the EU. And I like to tell this story around Article 3 of the Corporate and the Digital Single Market Directive, which at the moment is a bit more than a proposal. It is in the phase of a trialogue, meaning that when the Parliament approves the final test, it starts a new phase where the Parliament, the Commissions, the Council, and the European Commission decides on the final text. Article 3 is the idea that we need a text and data mining exception, which is, on the one side, very much needed, but on the other side is to formally recognize that to extract non-protected data from protected works, we need an authorization. So whereas at the corporate law level we need it, if you ask me, yes, we need it, at the corporate theory level, we should not need it. And it's actually a form of recognizing that, yes, data are, as a matter of fact, already protected. Unfortunately, and this exception actually has a number of good features, but unfortunately, it follows the same structure, the same design problem that I already identified in the InfoSoc directive. Very strong rights, very narrow and defined exceptions. So here, these 5 points tell us the problems with a very narrow formulation. Point 1 is not really problematic in the sense that text and data mining is defined in a way that possibly includes a lot of activities that nowadays we perform through web mining, text mining, data mining, machine learning. So this first part was actually probably the best executed part. But then the problems start with the scope. Article 3 is only an exception to the right of reproduction. It's not an exception to the right of communication to the public. It's not an exception to the right of redistribution. Meaning that if your trained model contains a substantial amount of the original corpora, you cannot redistribute it. You cannot publish it. You cannot stream it. This is something that doesn't happen with fair use, for example. Because fair use is a corporate exception. This is an exception to the right of reproduction. First problem. Second problem, beneficiaries. We are so scared in Europe that Google might benefit from this exception that it is only available to research organizations who have lawful access for research purposes. So if you're not a research organization, if you're a research organization that operates for a purpose that is not in this specific case research, but is criticism, review, parody, journalism, you're not covered. I skip on this one because Professor Reichmann already spent some time and explained it much better than what I can do. But whereas the exception clarifies that contracts contrary to the exception are not enforceable, which is very important. This is a very good thing. Because often in order to have access to big amounts of data which are owned by publishers, you need to accept some sort of terms of agreement. If that term says you cannot data mine, then you know that that contractual condition is not enforceable. Nevertheless, if the exact same condition is expressed chronologically through DRMs, then the same thing doesn't happen. And you can effectively limit through technology what we just said cannot be limited through law, which is, again, quite illogical, if you ask me. So, what do we need? I wrote this first part of the solution when we were still in a discussion phase. It didn't happen, so I just stroke it through. But I would have said at least option 4, so do not limit text and data mining to certain beneficiaries. Make it available to anyone for any purpose. Also, why do you want to exclude startups? Why do you want to exclude journalists? You just told us that quality journalism is so important that you created a new right, a press publisher right. And now here you're excluding journalists from this fundamental activity. This didn't happen. What we need in Europe to really achieve an open science environment from a legal perspective is an open norm. An open norm that has the flexibility, the built-in flexibility to balance, again, I won't talk about creativity and access anymore, investments and innovation. This is what we need. This is why Europe is falling behind in innovation system, but this is an area where if we could find a solution, it would unlock an enormous amount of knowledge and value that the European Union, especially in the scientific environment, possesses. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Thomas. Turn it off?
No.
Okay. So, is there any questions from the audience? Comment to make? Yes. Recorded, so we need to use this.
Well, I just want to point out that one of the little lesser known advantages of fair use in the United States is that it uncovers the need for future exceptions that nobody thought of at the time. And that's what's missing here, because the court looks at it and says, I'm not going to stop this transformative use, this transformative activity because you have a copyright. And then you have an exception, and it's there, and then it can be if you start to get conflicting decisions, then you or different interpretations of that, then you get a codified exception that means something. But usually fair use is where you first start out, and that's just lacking here. And remember, in fair use, you don't have the lobbyist, the commercial lobbyist talking to the court. You have a complainant, you have this, but you have a case that the judge is free to decide. So that's a big problem.
There is another element here that I think is interesting in the EU, which is it's a terminological one. Once we had free uses and exceptions and limitations, but even in Bern, certain exceptions are not called a free use, an exception, but a free use. Now, courts, starting with legislators calling free uses exceptions, courts have started interpreting exceptions as a court would interpret an exception, meaning narrowly. So we have things that at international level are called free uses that we didn't really notice when started to be called exceptions and started to be interpreted as exceptions, so narrowly, not analogically, etc., 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 which is also, I guess, something is not happening in the States, right?
And even worse, by using the three-step test under R13, you put on a compensation requirement as well, which is built all over the directive. So this is not good for what we need. Let's hope that CODATA comes up. I know they're working. I work with Paul Euler actually on some of the stuff we're going to contribute to your meeting in November. And let's hope that you keep going forward. And certainly you're far ahead of everybody else. So let's hope you keep going and succeeding.
Can I give an anecdote to support Thomas's point about the suppression of creativity in Europe. Many years ago, the US Geological Survey, who have been, since the early days of satellite imagery, being the holders of Landsat imagery, up till about 20 years ago, they used to sell imagery, and they'd sell it for about $1,000. And in a typical year, they'd sell about 200 packages for $1,000 each. You can calculate how much income that brought them in. 20 years ago, they decided to stop that, and they would make it available free to anyone who asks. Now they get they distribute 30,000 every year. Well, actually, that was 5 years ago. Maybe it's more now. And when I asked them some years ago how much difference had it made to the economics of this, they said they had no idea. And it was impossible to calculate, but they said, we've now got an incredible number of international collaborations, and we're absolutely sure the benefit of that is enormous. And then another story, of course, is the US Meteorological Service, which decided that it would release its MET data and its forecasts, the basic modeling that gives forecasts. And what that did, it inspired usually a lot of young people to come up with clever applications which you can put on your little iPhone and the like. And I think the general rule is, except where you're building the next aeroplane and you're in strong competition, that the more readily you give out data at the upstream end, the more likely it is benefits will flow at the downstream end. In other words, you stimulate creativity by doing that.
Yes, did you know that you have put your finger on one of the most important provisions of American copyright law, 105. Government-generated data is open to the public. It cannot be, the government of the United States cannot take copyright in any of the data that it generates. So of course what happens is that exactly the government feeds the data to would-be applicants, and then those who apply the data, they can get copyrights, but not the government by law. And I have elsewhere argued and written that I don't think any provision in American law has done more for the advancement of science than that one, that government-generated data cannot be copyrighted. And I think it's one the world needs to learn a lesson from. Section 105 of the 76 Act.
Please introduce you.
Okay, Emanuele Olivetti from Fondazione Bruno Kessler. And so my question, the examples were all about EU and US. And big companies, they are all in US, not in Europe. But what about Asia and, for example, China? There are huge companies, they are dragging incredible amount of data and using them, and they are not in the picture here. So maybe we can spend some words on that.
Not really, in the sense that I'm not too aware of the Chinese legal system and of how they are doing it. I do know that a number of international players are not too happy about how Chinese companies are behaving, especially in relation to European and US technologies. I don't know how much this is connected to that and how much this is connected with how international investments in China happen. I do know that in other, innovation-oriented areas outside US and Europe, Japan, Singapore, South Korea, and a number of them, they either move towards a fair use model, even if they came from more Anglo-Saxon traditions. So it would have been, at least it was in the corporate, that fair dealing, so much narrower. They, either through legislative reform or court interpretation, they move towards a more open standard. Or as in Japan, they have a very broad exception for data analytics, which covers almost everything, and it's not limited to beneficiaries or to type of uses, which is a different technique, a different legislative technique to approach the problem. It wouldn't be my first choice, but it's certainly better than what we have in Europe at the moment. I don't know if anyone else knows more about, your question specific to the Chinese environment.
The Chinese undermine trade secret law rather than the other areas we're talking about, because in order for the foreign company to be allowed to sell in China, they are obliged to discourage, to reveal the know-how behind their products. And that is a sine qua non condition, and that the current administration has made violent objections to this obligation to disclose your technological secrets, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah, that's one of the elements of the war trade started now, so the appropriation of US technology. Yeah, that's how I heard it too.
Anyone else? No, maybe I'll ask a question very quickly to Thomas. I think that you have been thinking about this golden standard for a while, but have you thought about a name that you would give to it, maybe in the next proposal, directive?
Exception?
Yes.
Well,
instead of calling it exception, would you call it how?
Well, certainly we learn we cannot call it fair use because even those who are in favor of a more flexible exception for some reason are scared that we are becoming a province of the US, so we cannot call it fair use. I honestly haven't thought of a name. I probably should, yeah. There are so many that we could use, like common sense provision or, I don't know. There are a number of them. But you're right, probably if we want to, I don't particularly like the expression, but sell the idea properly, we should also brand it with the right name, a name that is not unnecessarily, confrontative towards the interest of industry. I mean, I honestly don't think that industry will be particularly affected by a broader exception. It would just have to change its business model. It's just that to change a business model creates some uncertainty, and until when they're not obliged to do it, they won't do it. But in the moment in which it must be done, I honestly don't believe it will actually create any additional shortcoming to established business models. I don't see U.S. companies, right-holder companies, fleeing the States because it has suddenly become a pirate country that doesn't protect corporate law just because of fair use.
Unless you call it free, perhaps. So the word free might not be there.
Yeah, no, I think so. One thing that I didn't say that I wanted to say because I discovered it fairly recently is that there is EU legislation, very specific, very sectorial, and I think largely based on antitrust law, which is an area of law that I don't control very much, that obliges certain privately owned data to be made public. I know that it has happened at the EU level in the financial sector, not all the data, just very specific data. I know that certain member states, such as in France, have obliged certain sectors, such as transport, but even if it is privately owned, to make certain data publicly available. And I think that the idea behind is quite powerful because we're basically acknowledging that certain data, if not all data, have a public function and thus cannot be made, privatized. And this is particularly important. I see there is a question, but this is particularly important because one of the rationales for that proposal that we saw of creating a data producer right is that firms that collect a lot of data keep them secret because they do not have an incentive to make them public, because once public, they're unprotected.
Hi, I'm Giorgio from CIMEC. Actually, the question is related to what you just told us, and it's about the new bank regulation in the EU and the fintech field. So before, if I understood well, before 2016, all the data that banks collected from users were protected. I mean, they stayed within the bank, and it was property of banks, and also there was this privacy concern that at least in Europe, our data on how we spend money couldn't be shared. And then now, after 2016, the banks are obliged to offer a standard API to assess our data and the data, and this pushed the innovation and maybe some new business model in the fintech industries. So I think that this kind of regulation is a bit weird in the sense that it doesn't take into account the privacy of the people. And so it takes into account the data ownership, it takes into account I mean, I think it's in the direction to push innovation and try to push some startup become bigger. Yeah, I just want to know what you think about and why there is this big lack of concern about privacy about that. Because, for example, these fintech use a lot of data mining, and what I don't know, maybe for example, the banks data are the banks are obliged to share the data, but I don't think that the fintech, since they are not considered banks straightforward, they have to share their own data.
I'm afraid that I cannot really tell you much more than what you just told us, in the sense that it's an area of law that, or especially it's a reform that I only recently discovered. So, you know, you have more details than what I do. But your understanding is the same that I ever had. It's an area that I think we would need to analyze it more in depth. It's not completely clear to me whether only competition law issues were at the basis of this reform, or also consumer protection it's there. For the privacy aspect, I cannot tell you too much. I think actually I can forward the question to our privacy expert, Paolo, who has unfortunately always to know everything about privacy, which I think is quite hard. I think, however, that as a symbol, it's quite interesting, because it's the idea that certain data, I shared the privacy concern with you. I would expect that the data that has to be made public has either it's not personal, or if it is, has been properly anonymized. And as we repeated a number of times today, Richard, this morning, there is an issue with what anonymization really means. But putting this aspect on the side, and I don't know if Paolo has more on that, I think that the idea that certain data have a public function, thus even if privately owned, they must be made public, because they enhance competition, they enhance access, they enhance open science, they enhance social uses, they enhance startups, etc., 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 then it makes a lot of sense. So I think it's a move in the right direction. That said, I don't know enough to really, give you much more details. I will in the future. I find it extremely interesting.
I got a question for Professor Bolton. In some way you said that universities still have the power to drive this process. I'm wondering, how would you translate this or traduce this in the educational part? What would you do to prepare the next generation to be more sensitive to this subject?
is quite easy, really. Easy and difficult. Yes. Well, what's been happening to universities over the last 30, 40, 50 years? It might surprise you to know that both in Britain and North America, in the late 60s and early 70s, the normal term used by academics themselves in public when they described what they did, they described themselves as, wait for it, university teachers. It's 30 years since I've heard that phrase. Now we call ourselves university researchers most of the time. In the questionnaires and studies that established that, now what, 40 years ago, they also asked how important was research. The answer was 10% thought it was quite important. And yet we have this illusion that going back in the depths of time, research and teaching have been inextricably linked. In my experience, highly specialized researchers are often rather poor teachers because their experience is rather narrow. Give me a scholar any day who has a broader vision. What have we done in the meantime? We've created this enormous mountain of research, much of which is frankly hopeless, whether it's been funded or not. You could shove it into the Adige River and no one would care. And what do? We spend all our time doing research, spend proportionately less and less time educating our students, which is arguably the most important thing we ever do. If we didn't have students, they'd close us down tomorrow, and quite rightly. If you asked me the question, I mean, we had a discussion yesterday about this, and my argument would be that if you ask what is the vector by which university knowledge finds its way out into the public domain, it's by the thousands and thousands of graduates who go out every year equipped with the latest knowledge in their fields. The occasional gizmo that someone sells to a private company is drowned into insignificance by that, and yet we spend all our time gizmo creating and not actually thinking about how knowledge might underpin the human future. You know, I think we should hold our heads in shame, actually. And having someone who's run a university, I probably hold my head deeper in shame than the rest of you do. The question is, what do we do about it? Well, the problem is we've spent so long taking the state's money, and as we say in Scotland, he who pays the piper calls the tune. And the question is, how do we detach ourselves from that? One of the things that we should remember is, of course, the reason why universities are held in high regard is that in the countries represented here, something like 50% of the age cohort go to university. Their parents care about their offspring who care about their university. You know, we're deeply embedded in the public domain, but we don't use it. Well, actually we do. We chase rich people and ask them to give us a few $1 million for a fancy new research lab. You know, I'd somehow wonder whether we've rather lost our soul. That may be rather romantic though. We may never have had a soul. We may always have been so devoted to the rich and powerful and the like, but that doesn't mean to say we shouldn't have a Damascene conversion and turn to the light, because our societies are changing. And one fundamental way it's changed is that, I mean, when I was a student, when I went to university, 3% of the age cohort went to the university. I was the first person in 1,000 years who'd gone from my village to a university. But that's completely changed. So the nature of society has changed, and I'm not sure we've adapted to it. I think we also accept things which ought to be unacceptable. You know, these ridiculous ranking tables. They commit all the errors that we try to persuade our students not to commit, and yet we accept them. We boast about going up the scale. They're meaningless. I mean, I'm ashamed to say this. If a friend of mine asked me, as they often have, where should I send my daughter or son? I say to them, well, what do you want? What does she want or he want? Is it a brand or is it an education? If it's a brand, I say, come to Edinburgh or Oxford or Cambridge. If it's an education, I say, go to Abertay, not to his university and not to my university either. Because we are, I mean, my university, we become so research obsessed that it is, I mean, or as you say, I'm almost lost for words. But I think there are things we can do, and I think that, I mean, when we were talking, for instance, about the way in which we work with publishers to undermine the very work that we think we're doing, we should organize ourselves. I mean, I'm glad to say in Germany that's been happening, in the States. I mean, there's a friend of mine who is the director of the American Research Libraries, which is Canada and the US. And he says, the amount of money we spend on publications, we could buy Elsevier tomorrow, and if we did that, then we could also drive all the others out of business as well. Well, why don't we do it? So I think we should ask Lenin's question. We know what the problems are. Let's get on and do it.
Thank you.